When I was 12, my parents told me they were sending me to a summer camp for 2 weeks. I was quite the homebody at that age, and I think they thought this would help me develop social skills before I ended up with some anxiety issue. Looking back, I understand their reasoning. No parent wants their child to grow up as a strange loner who feels disconnected from the world. Attending that camp did give me a bit more confidence in dealing with people, but it certainly wasn't in the way they had hoped. To say I wasn't excited about going to summer camp would be an understatement. When my parents told me, I nearly cried right there. I swore I would do anything to avoid being sent to what I thought would be a wilderness prison for 2 weeks. I tried to improve my hygiene and act friendlier, but my parents weren't open to negotiating. They were giving me an order. I was going to camp whether I liked it or not, and if they had to drag me kicking and screaming onto the bus, so be it. Honestly, I cried myself to sleep the night before departure, and I was fighting tears on the way to the bus that would take us to camp. It was only when I got on the bus with the other kids that I thought I wouldn't cry again. Even then, I was frozen in fear, surrounded by a group of loud teens. 3 kids even asked me what was wrong, and all I could do was sit there, gripped by anxiety as they speculated if I was different. It was incredibly humiliating, and I actually wondered if I could escape during a break at a rest stop. But where would I go? What would I do? It was a classic case of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and I obviously chose the hard place. The first few days at camp were challenging, to say the least. I barely talked to anyone, disliked the food, and found the activities to be my version of hell. I admit I was spoiled in that sense, having always eaten my favorite foods while sleeping in my own bedroom as an only child. The reality of eating mediocre food and sleeping in a cabin with 5 other kids was a tough adjustment. My anxiety peaked during mealtimes, especially because the boys and girls camps shared the dining hall. It wasn't all the girls that made me anxious either. There was one girl in particular named Samantha. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. Popular, smart, graceful, and confident. During lunch and dinner, I found myself staring at her, except when she looked my way. Then I'd just focus on my food, praying she didn't notice me. I was torn between hoping she'd come over to talk to me and wishing she'd stay far away so I wouldn't embarrass myself. Eventually, one of those prayers was answered, and it led to one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I'll never forget how sweet her voice was when she asked if she could sit with me for a few moments. I completely froze, but she was confident enough to smile, giggle, and sit down across from me. Once she started asking my name and where I was from, I managed to pull myself together enough to talk. Her curiosity about me, combined with the envious looks from other boys, gave me a significant confidence boost. I wasn't suddenly transformed into a social butterfly, but I felt a little lighter for the rest of the day. The same thing happened the next evening at dinner when Samantha came over to chat about various topics. By the end of the week, I had made friends with 2 other socially awkward kids, and she finally asked me the crucial question: if I wanted to meet her down at the swimming lake that night before lights out. As you might guess, this was completely against camp rules. Boys and girls were not allowed to socialize outside of designated activities or in the dining hall, but that made it all the more exciting for me. She clearly liked me enough to risk getting in trouble, and believe it or not, there was a time when I would have jumped at the chance to go home early. However, after meeting and talking to Samantha, I realized I didn't want to leave at all. The thrill of this secret meeting made me nervous, but I said yes and planned how I would sneak down to the lake without getting caught by the counselors. When the time came, my friends wished me luck and gave me tips on how to play it cool. I made my way to the lake, but my heart sank when I found that she wasn't there. I feared I had built up my hopes for nothing, but felt too anxious to leave in case she showed up and thought I wasn't interested. I waited for 5 minutes, then 10, and finally heard someone approaching the trail. Out from the trees came none other than Samantha, carrying 2 towels. As we talked, I felt a mix of nerves, excitement, fear, and joy. Above all, it felt like a victory. I could socialize, I could date pretty girls, and perhaps even become one of the popular kids. My ego might have inflated dangerously, but by the time Samantha arrived, I couldn't see how our meeting could go wrong. When she suggested we strip down to our swimwear and go for a quick swim, I was so infatuated that I didn't consider how it might not be the best idea. We changed into our swimsuits and stepped off the dock into the water. It was cold, which was a blessing, as it allowed me to pretend I was shaking from the chill rather than from nerves about being in my swimsuit with such a pretty girl. We swam quietly for a while, and at one point, Samantha shared that she loved swimming and was on a competitive team at her school back in Willow Creek. She mentioned that she could hold her breath for almost a minute and asked if I wanted to see her prove it. I was happy to watch, so I said yes. When she sank under the water, I counted until she resurfaced, gasping for air after 52 seconds. I was thoroughly impressed. That was an incredible feat for someone of her size. Then she asked how long I could hold my breath. I told her I didn't know, but I would gladly go under the water so she could count for me. I ducked down, hearing her sweet voice counting above me, and I tried to keep track of the seconds while my lungs started to ache. Suddenly, I noticed her counting had stopped, just as I felt something enter the water beside me. I kicked to the surface to see what it was, and that's when I felt a hand on my head, pushing me down and keeping me submerged. I opened my eyes and saw that Samantha was no longer in front of me, meaning whoever was holding me down must have been behind me or up on the dock. Panic set in as I reached up to remove the hand, but it wouldn't budge. I had always been a bit weak, and with my lungs burning, I found it impossible to fight back. After a few seconds, I started to lose consciousness, and my last thought was that I was going to die. That realization sparked a final rush of panic, but then I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. I stopped struggling and just let go. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the dock, coughing up water as someone asked if I could hear them. In a daze, I couldn't remember what had happened. As I looked around, I saw Samantha crying while one of the counselors comforted her. It was only then that the memory of the hand holding me under returned. I had gone from feeling the happiest I'd ever been to thinking I was dying. I had no idea who had held me under, but Samantha did, and her guilt made her confess quickly to the counselor. Apparently, it had been an elaborate prank aimed at me, the nervous kid, but she didn't know they planned to drown me. From what I gathered, she had panicked when she saw them keeping me underwater for too long and rushed to get a counselor to intervene. EMTs and police arrived shortly after, and I was taken to the head counselor's office. As you can imagine, it became a huge deal. What was intended to be a cruel prank turned into what law enforcement labeled attempted murder. The kids involved were arrested and taken away that night, and the one who held my head under ended up in juvenile detention for a couple of years. My parents came to pick me up the next day, and my mom gave the head counselor a piece of her mind about potentially seeing them in court before practically shoving me into the car. I didn't cry when I went to camp, but I did cry when leaving. I felt a whirlwind of emotions. I was glad to escape a place where I almost lost my life, but sad to leave my first real friends and Samantha behind. I knew she was part of the prank against me, and while I felt some bitterness about that, I also recognized that she cared enough to seek help when she realized they were trying to harm me. I can't describe how much that meant to me, and looking back, I realize how strange that sounds, but in my naive 12-year-old mind, it was proof she liked me, even if not in the way I wanted. In an odd twist, almost dying at camp turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life. I learned that death, the scariest thought I had, wasn't so terrible when confronted directly. I found a sense of acceptance and peace, and after that moment, I realized I wasn't scared of much anymore. I discovered I could make friends, that I could be brave, and I ended up trying things I never thought I could, like Anatoly Slivkov was born on December 28, 1938, in the Dagestan region of the former Soviet Union. Following a harsh childhood impacted by the hardships of World War II, he built a life for himself in the city of Novaya Mysk, near Stavropol. He had 2 children with his wife, Ludmila. To outsiders, Anatoly was an exemplary communist and a cornerstone of the community, dedicating much of his time to a local children's organization. Each summer, this group organized camps that provided hardworking parents a temporary break from child-rearing responsibilities. Parents trusted their kids with Anatoly, but this trust was tragically misplaced, as he hid a dark secret that wouldn't be revealed until it was far too late. In 1961, Anatoly witnessed a terrible traffic accident while returning home from downtown Novaya Mysk. A drunk driver on a heavy Soviet motorcycle had sped around a nearly blind turn, crashing into a group of pedestrians. One of the victims was a young boy in a Young Pioneers uniform, a youth organization akin to the Boy Scouts in America. The boy's body was in a horrific state, clearly killed on impact, with his head and neck nearly crushed. Yet, his uniform remained oddly intact, creating an image that Anatoly would remember for the rest of his life. The memory wasn't haunting due to the violence or the uniform, but because it was the first time Anatoly felt an unsettling desire from witnessing the remains of a deceased child. He later described how, as the smell of gasoline and smoke filled the air, he succumbed to a fog of intense longing. In the months that followed, Anatoly sought ways to get closer to local children without raising suspicion from their parents. It quickly became clear that he could gain their trust by becoming a local youth leader. Once he earned the community's complete confidence, he would exploit his position to carry out horrifying acts of abuse. The most vulnerable children were those attending the annual summer camps run by the youth organization, where they were away from their guardians. During these camps, Anatoly focused on specific boys aged 11 to 15, who were usually shorter for their age and easily manipulated. He would convince them to wear the Young Pioneers uniform, just like the boy from the tragic accident. Once dressed, he would instill fear in them by suggesting that their small stature would lead to bullying. When they expressed a desire to be taller, he would claim to know of an experiment involving a method of controlled stretching of the spine. Essentially, he would hang the boys as if it were an execution, but assured them he would rescue them once they lost consciousness. In some cases, he would tell groups of boys they were to reenact a partisan's hanging by Nazi soldiers, emphasizing the honor associated with playing the role of a Soviet martyr. Generally, Anatoly kept his word, reviving the boys shortly after they passed out. However, he would strip them and subject their unconscious bodies to unspeakable acts that they would never recall. On several occasions, once the boys were utterly helpless, Anatoly committed far worse actions. Over the next 22 years, he allegedly persuaded nearly 50 boys to take part in his grotesque experiments. In 36 instances, he revived the boys, often photographing the abuse before forcing them to vow silence. But in 7 of these cases, his thoughts drifted back to that fateful day. He saw the young pioneer convulsing, surrounded by blood, smoke, and flames. In those moments, he would begin to dismember the boys while they were still alive, starting with their heads, then pouring gasoline over their remains before setting them ablaze, all to relive the horror of the traffic accident from 1961, which had awakened his twisted desires. Once disposed of, Anatoly would keep their shoes as sick trophies, along with the photographs he had taken, to remember those he had slaughtered. As horrifying as it may be to acknowledge, these perverse keepsakes likely saved numerous lives. Whenever he felt the urge to kill, he would revisit these items, which seemed to quell his craving for the sight of blood and the burning flesh of innocent children. It was only when he grew weary of his trophies that he sought to relive the scenes of the accident again, potentially preventing many more than just 7 young victims. On June 2, 1964, Anatoly claimed his first victim, a 15-year-old runaway named Nikolai Dobrchev. Anatoly later insisted that Nikolai's death was an accident. He failed to revive the boy once he lost consciousness. Realizing the young man was dead, Anatoly dismembered the body and buried it in the woods near the summer camp. He then destroyed all the photos of Nikolai, fearing they could be used against him for murder. In May 1965, Anatoly took his second victim, Alexei Kovalenko, who was attending a summer camp where Anatoly was a trusted counselor. The photographs he took of Alexei held his monstrous lust at bay for 8 years. However, on November 14, 1973, a 15-year-old boy named Alexander Nezhmyanov vanished from the streets of Anatoly's hometown. The investigation by the Soviet police failed to connect Anatoly to the boy's disappearance. 2 years later, another child was abducted, 11-year-old Andrei Poguzhin, who went missing after telling his mother that a man had invited him to a nearby forest to star in a short film. This time, Anatoly's reputation as a filmmaker led the police to visit him, but his standing in the community meant they merely inquired if he knew the identity of this mysterious director. Anatoly claimed ignorance, and they left him unbothered. The close call with law enforcement made Anatoly wait another 5 years before snatching another child, biding his time until 1980, when he became fixated on a 13-year-old named Sergei Fatnev, who bore a striking resemblance to the dying young pioneer. His final victim was taken in July 1985, when 13-year-old Sergei Pavlov vanished after telling a neighbor he was going to meet the leader of Churchit. This revelation implicated Anatoly, as he was the public face of the Churchit youth organization. In November 1985, a Soviet prosecutor began investigating Anatoly concerning Sergei Pavlov's disappearance. While questioning club members, the prosecutor learned that many of them had experienced what was described as temporary amnesia during summer camp. When pressed for details, the boys frequently mentioned Anatoly's abhorrent experiments, noting they would black out and then awaken feeling sore and tender. Following the prosecutor's investigation, a shocking narrative of abuse began to emerge, all pointing back to Anatoly and his summer camps. Finally, in December 1985, police visited Anatoly's home in Stavropol and arrested him on 7 counts of murder. It remains unclear if he was tortured in custody or if another method was used to obtain his cooperation, but within a month, Anatoly led officers to the burial sites of 6 of his 7 victims after confessing in detail. The Soviet judge overseeing his trial was deeply disturbed by the nature of his crimes and believed the only just punishment was a death sentence. Following the sentencing, Anatoly was placed on death row at Nabokar prison, marking the end of a 2-decade spree of abuse and murder that robbed nearly 50 boys of their innocence. However, in 1989, Anatoly was given a final chance to save his life. Police from Rostov Oblast approached him, stating that if he could help them identify a mysterious serial killer, his death sentence could be commuted to life in prison. This serial killer had already claimed at least 29 children's lives, and the authorities had no leads to follow. The killer turned out to be the notorious Andrei Chikatilo, who would eventually be convicted of murdering 52 women and children in October 1992. Anatoly did his best to assist with the investigation, providing insights into his own criminal mentality, but it was of no use to the Rostov officers. Following the interrogation, Anatoly was forcibly removed from the interview room and taken to an execution chamber. As he pleaded for his life, a prison officer pressed the barrel of his gun to the back of Anatoly's head and pulled the trigger, ending his life with a single shot. In a twisted sense, this was a more dignified death than what he had inflicted upon his victims. Vulnerable boys who had no idea they were placing their trust in a man with malevolent intentions. Their deaths served only to fulfill the sick fantasies of a truly evil individual. When the executioner ended Anatoly's life in September 1989, the world undoubtedly became a little brighter. I grew up in a small town called Birchwood, located a couple of hours' drive from Edmonton, Alberta, nestled along the river that shares its name. Birchwood was a great place to be raised, and for about 4 to 5 months each year, the town transformed into a true winter wonderland. As a result, winter sports were a huge part of my life, along with other snowy activities like building snowmen and throwing snowballs at my childhood friend who lived nearby on 52nd Street. Alberta felt like home, and I thought the farthest I would move would be to Edmonton for work. However, my family would eventually take me farther from home than I ever expected. My career choice led me to live and work in Brisbane, Australia. I moved there in 2007, met a girl, got married, and we decided to settle down and start a family in Australia. Since my family was more able to travel, they flew over to Brisbane about once or twice a year during the first few years of their grandchildren's lives. They had only heard stories about their dad's homeland and, more importantly, had never seen snow. My daughter, Lily, was just about 6, and my son, Ben, was 4 when my wife and I decided it was time for a change. We organized a trip back to Alberta for Christmas in 2017. Lily was especially excited, while Ben had no idea what to expect. When we landed in Edmonton and drove the 80 miles to my parents' house, their minds were blown by the fluffy white blankets of snow lining the highway. Showing them my old hometown was a fantastic experience, and the kids had a wonderful time with their grandparents. But what truly captivated their attention was the snow. It's worth noting that in Australia, Christmas is celebrated much like it is in Canada, except for the weather. Deep winter in the northern hemisphere is high summer in the southern, so despite all the festive, wintry advertising, it can be blisteringly hot outside in December. I can't express how strange it is to see a restaurant display fake snow on its sign when it's 40 degrees Celsius in the shade. I often get the impression that Australians would happily zap their entire country with a frost ray for 24 hours just to match the festivities. For my kids, having the scenery match the Christmas spirit felt as magical as a trip to Disneyland and came at half the price. They wanted to be outside in the snow every waking moment, doing all the things I had loved as a kid. Wearing warm winter clothing was such a novelty for them, too. Lily once said she couldn't decide if she felt more like an Eskimo or an astronaut. It was that new to them. They loved it so much that when my wife spotted an advertisement for a winter glamping experience at a place called Frosty Lodge, we eagerly booked an overnight stay in one of their family-sized yurts. We drove there on December 22nd, arriving around noon, and by 1:30, we were all set up and ready to build a snowman army. We played in the snow for a few hours. Then my wife went into the yurt to prepare dinner on the small camping stove provided by the lodge. The kids and I continued playing as the sky began to darken. After one particularly intense snowball fight, where my kids formed an unexpected alliance and teamed up against me, we started feeling pretty hungry. We were only about 50 yards from the yurt, so after telling my daughter to keep an eye on her little brother, I jogged back to check on my wife. She said dinner would be ready in just a few minutes. I then jogged back to where the kids had been playing and saw Lily starting to build the base of yet another snowman. But when I looked around for Ben, he was nowhere in sight. I assumed he couldn't have gone far, but after searching and not finding him, I asked Lily where he was. She looked up from her snowman, glanced around, and then a look of visible concern crossed her face when she realized he was missing. She looked at me with a trembling voice and said, "I don't know." I think she thought I would be mad at her. I was a bit upset, but that anger was completely overtaken by a frantic panic that only a parent knows. Then I remembered I could track Ben's little boot prints in the snow. I followed his trail until I was greeted by a sight that sent a chill through me as a parent. A frigid stream. It didn't look too deep or wide, but it was just the right size for a 4-year-old to fall in and get swept away. An older child might have been able to cross the series of small stepping stones at one of its narrower and shallower sections. But if Ben fell downstream, he could easily drown in that icy water. I ran up and down the banks of the stream, desperately looking for my son's body while shouting his name, hoping he'd hear me and come running. Those were the most terrifying moments of my life, made even worse by the fact that my daughter was right there, witnessing my terrified breakdown. I can't imagine how frightened she was. Not only did she not fully understand what was happening, but she also felt responsible for it. I kept running up and down the bank, not paying much attention to the opposite side of the stream. It seemed impossible that Ben had crossed it on his own without being overwhelmed by the current. Then, I finally heard him call out to me. I turned around to see him standing right where I hadn't expected him, on the other side of the stream. He didn't seem scared or anxious. He was just trudging through the snow in his coat and boots like he didn't have a care in the world. I definitely startled him when I bounded across the stream, ran up to him, and scooped him up into my arms. I didn't yell at him, but he definitely picked up on my energy and started crying when he saw his sister, who was also in tears by that point. I carried him back to the yurt, where my very confused and upset wife greeted us. When I explained what had happened, she was angry with me, then mad at Lily, then back to being mad at me again. We were all a mess, but mostly just relieved we found Ben and avoided being the cause of an Amber Alert. Once we calmed down, we had dinner and started putting the kids to bed. Before tucking Ben in, who was almost completely worn out, I asked him something that had been nagging at me since just after dinner. I asked him how he got across the stream. We were all incredibly relieved to have found him safe, so that was all I could think about until we finished eating. When I was running along the banks of the stream, I had expected him to be on our side or in the water. It seemed impossible that he could have crossed on his own. I wanted to find out what happened, so I asked him, and his answer sent chills down my spine. The snowman carried me. Now, obviously, a snowman couldn't have carried my son across an icy stream, but someone did. Just the thought of it made me feel sick. I told Ben that couldn't have been true. I asked again very gently if the snowman he meant was actually a person wearing white clothes or maybe someone with snow on their hair or shoulders. He shook his head and repeated, "The snowman carried me." Before I could ask anything else, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. I don't think he was out for more than 5 or 10 minutes. I told my wife what our son had just said, and soon we were packing up our things, dressing the kids, and heading to our car. What happened was bizarre, but it was clear that someone had taken my son, even if it was only for a minute or two. Thank God they had the sudden urge to let him go. Maybe because they heard my screams and decided to run before getting caught. I was grateful for that, but wasn't about to stay overnight while being potentially stalked by a child snatcher. We made sure to inform a representative of the campground on our way out. I don't know what they did in response, but there was no way we were staying there. We drove home without even thinking to ask for a refund, still shaken by the experience. The very next morning, I contacted the police regarding what had happened. Not long after, they called us back to confirm our worst fears. On the other side of the stream, along with Ben's smaller footprints, were a set of much larger footprints that I was convinced belonged to his potential abductor. Ben later mentioned that the person who had carried him wore a white hat or at least light-colored clothing, and that after carrying him for a minute or two through the woods, they simply set him down and walked away. Ben heard my yelling and trudged off in the direction of my voice, leading to our reunion. I asked Ben if the man had said anything to him, and he said no. When I asked if he had been scared, oddly, he said no to that too. My son wasn't the kind of child to be overly trusting or friendly, so it was unusual for him not to react if a stranger picked him up. When I asked if he had cried or yelled out or struggled when the stranger had appeared and scooped him up, Ben again just said no. Maybe he thought it was me. Maybe he was mesmerized by the magical and alien landscape in the woods. Perhaps he was just sleepy, which is why he didn't freak out. But thinking about that stranger taking my son and Ben not even making a sound sends shivers down my spine. Longtime lurker here, finally sharing a tale with you all, and you'll be glad to hear it isn't one of those creepy guy stared at me stories. Instead, it's about how my college buddy, Marcus, and I nearly got killed in the woods. I know some listeners might think that almost got killed means a lot of creepy staring and very little actual danger, but hold tight. I have the story and the scar to prove it. I don't know what got into me and my friend Marcus during college, but we got really into survivalism during our sophomore year at the University of Colorado, Denver. Living off campus, working part-time jobs, and being just a stone's throw away from places like Mount Evans and the Rockies. We started hiking as a way to get exercise and relieve stress. We had hiked during our freshman year on campus, but once we moved to an apartment near Colfax Avenue, we watched a movie one night in mid-October called Alive. This movie tells the true story of a rugby team from South America whose plane crashes in the Andes Mountains. The injured survivors have to eat the flesh of their deceased friends to survive, which helps them orchestrate their rescue. It's a gripping film that really captivated both Marcus and me. We couldn't help but wonder what we would do in a similar situation, mainly debating how hungry we'd have to be before resorting to cannibalism. Obviously, we didn't want to test that theory, but we figured we could do the next best thing. Head into the mountains during the winter and try camping for a night or two to see if we could handle it. Now, let me emphasize that you should not try this at home. Camping in the wilderness can be dangerous, especially in the dead of winter, but naturally, my college-age buddy Marcus and I thought it was a brilliant idea. So we began planning a camping weekend for after the holidays. We kept arranging things over Christmas, and the first weekend back at school, we drove to Echo Lake Park near Mount Evans to park our car before heading into the snowy woods towards Mount Goliath. After hiking a couple of miles, we found a great sheltered spot among some pine trees. We set down our gear and started clearing a space for our camp. I won't bore you with the details of how miserable it was to camp under those conditions. It was pretty awful. Everything stayed wet all the time, making it hard to keep the fire going, and we hardly got any sleep. It was so bad that we decided to pack up around 6:30 or 7 a.m. to use the early light to navigate back to our car and escape to the warmth of home and hot showers. I used my jet boil to make us some coffee inside the tent. If you don't have one, I highly recommend getting one. Once we were warm and caffeinated, we started packing up our things. Marcus finished before me and opened the tent flap, saying he was going to take a quick bathroom break. I groaned, still half asleep, and continued my packing. A few moments later, Marcus returned, squatting by the entrance of the tent, and asked, "Is your knife within reach?" The first thing that crossed my mind was that he must have seen a bear or something. Sometimes bears wake up early from hibernation and, without food around, can be a significant danger to campers. But when I asked Marcus what was wrong, he said, "There's a guy out here." I felt relieved to hear it wasn't a starving bear. It was just a man. I almost laughed, thinking about how some early morning hiker might have given Marcus a strange look while relieving himself. I chuckled and asked if that was all that scared him. That's when Marcus told me the guy had a gun. This didn't alarm me too much either. Sure, the man was hunting out of season, but if everyone panicked every time they saw an armed person in Colorado, the entire state would be in chaos. I don't know if I was too tired, too cold, or just eager to get out of there, but I couldn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. Maybe Marcus wasn't explaining it well, but I just sat there confused when we should have been fleeing. Suddenly, Marcus turned his head away, and I heard him scream for me to get out of the tent. I hadn't finished packing, but I jumped out as he instructed. Facing what terrified Marcus, I saw a lone hunter wearing a ski mask covering his entire face. He didn't say anything as we backed away from him. I can't recall our exact words, but we must have said something like, "We don't want any trouble, and if we trespassed, we didn't mean to. We'll leave." We kept talking, but this guy remained silent. Then he raised his rifle and aimed at us. What happened next is a blur. I remember seeing him lift the gun, and we both turned and ran as if our lives depended on it. The first shot was the loudest noise I'd ever heard, echoing all around us as we sprinted through the forest, away from our campsite. It felt like ages passed between the first and second shots, and I thought, he's aiming at us, and I'm dead. Then, bang, I felt something hit the back of my left thigh. I dropped but found I could still pick myself up and keep running, even without Marcus's help. I knew I'd been hit, not just from the jolt of the bullet fragment striking my leg, but also from the warm blood spilling down my thigh. It was a strange sensation, hot and cold at once. I ran faster, feeling the warmth mingling with the cold air hitting my skin, and I never want to feel that again. Long story short, we managed to get down the mountain after the hunter either lost sight of us or decided to get away before we could call the police. To say I got lucky would be an understatement. I had been hit, but not by a full bullet. Thanks to the trees, the hunter struggled to get a clear shot, and the bullet struck a tree, fragmenting and slashing the top rear of my thigh as I ran through the snow. The doctor told me that if the bullet had hit the tree differently or if I had been running slower, the fragment could have pierced my thigh and severed my femoral artery, killing me within minutes. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and I try not to think about it too hard. Dwelling on it brings back some intense fears, much like that hot and cold sensation I'd prefer not to experience again, or even ever. As for the guy who shot at us, the police questioned a few hunters but never arrested anyone or charged anyone for nearly killing us up there. If you ask me, I think the man was just a hunter who didn't intend to shoot anyone. But there are certainly people out there who want to know what it feels like to kill. I'm not saying all hunters think like that, far from it. I just know that at least one of them does. I used to work as a camp counselor at a summer camp in Florida, doing 2 consecutive years. The first summer went well, so I decided to return. I recognized many familiar faces, including counselors and campers, but there were also plenty of new ones that summer, including some great kids and some not-so-great ones. The worst of them was a kid we'll call Damien because he was a total nightmare. He was clearly trouble from the moment he arrived at camp. Damien was unkind to the other kids, disrespectful to counselors, and refused to follow directions. He had a vocabulary of curse words that was surprisingly advanced for a 9-year-old. We could handle brats, but a little psycho who genuinely frightened us was another matter entirely. Over the following week, Damien showed us he was just that. Damien was involved in 3 separate incidents, each more troubling than the last. The first was a minor fight with another kid. Nothing too serious, just a brief tussle that we had to break up and report to cover ourselves. Our head counselor reached out to his parents, suggesting they pick him up early, but they were on vacation and told us to deal with it or they'd sue for a full refund. After that, we attempted to keep Damien apart from most of the other kids by placing him with others who weren't as easy to pick on. This worked for a while, but it soon became clear that he was influencing the others negatively. The second incident occurred when a counselor went to check on Damien and his so-called friends in their cabin. They were unusually quiet, which was odd since they usually made a ruckus. When the counselor entered, she found Damien and his buddies huddled in a corner, fixated on something he had. The kids scattered when she walked in, and Damien hastily hid whatever it was under one of the bunk beds. The counselor asked to see his hands, but he just shook his head. Since we weren't allowed to physically touch the kids unless it was an emergency, she told them that if they showed her what Damien was hiding, they wouldn't get in trouble. One of them pointed under the bed, and she knelt down to look. What she found was a dead possum, or at least we thought it was a possum based on its size and shape. It could have been another animal, but Damien had clearly removed all its fur and turned it inside out. His hands were smeared with blood, and he had literally been caught red-handed. The other kids' hands were clean, but the fact that they silently watched while Damien mutilated an animal was horrifying. We had to report this, so we contacted Damien's parents again, saying they needed to either pick him up or we'd call the authorities for animal cruelty. We were hesitant to involve the police, knowing it could lead to negative publicity for the camp, which we couldn't afford. Damien's parents promised to end their vacation early, but said they couldn't get to camp for another day. It would be a long 2 days with Damien still causing chaos, but we couldn't keep him locked in his cabin. The next day, we took the kids on a history walk through the woods to a nearby Seminole tribe museum. The land the camp occupied used to belong to the Seminoles, and we wanted to teach the kids to appreciate and respect that history. The museum visit was a highlight, where a tribe member would discuss their history before the kids got to make headdresses. The 9-year-olds were the youngest group we took, and of course, Damien had to come along under strict supervision. Looking at the historical weapons was the only time Damien appeared quiet and interested. He was particularly captivated by a Seminole tomahawk on display and asked the museum curator if the Seminoles used them in battles. The curator mistakenly shared that they used them to scalp enemies, and I could see Damien's fascination growing. I had a sinking feeling about what he was concocting in his mind. Later that evening, as the kitchen team finished cleaning up after dinner, one of them started complaining about a missing knife. We overheard a back and forth between 2 staff members, one accusing the other of borrowing it. When someone mentioned the 4th graders had eaten last, I immediately thought, "Oh no, Damien." Rushing to his cabin, I heard a terrifying scream from inside. Bursting in, I found Damien holding one of his friends by the hair with a knife in the other hand. He was about to scalp the poor kid, and if I hadn't yelled his name, I truly believe he would have gone through with it. It was the look in his eyes and the grin on his face that sent chills down my spine. Part of me feared I was about to witness something horrific. Thankfully, his instinct was to hide the evidence under a bunk bed. After that, he tried to sneak past us as if he were playing a game. We detained him in the counselor's cabin and finally did what we should have done after discovering the dead possum. We called the police. The head counselor made the call, and when the officers arrived, they didn't seem surprised by Damien's behavior. We had no idea what would happen next, but the junior counselors and I thought they might take him to juvenile detention. After all, he had tried to scalp another kid. Imagine our shock when we learned that they couldn't arrest anyone under 10 years old, and it was up to us to contact Damien's parents to come get him. At least the police gave us the go-ahead to keep him confined in the counselor's office until his parents arrived. The next morning, he managed to wreak havoc, causing even more organizational issues, but compared to everything else, that was minor. When his parents finally showed up, we understood why Damien was the way he was. It was clear his home life was not healthy. The head counselor mentioned that they would likely receive a visit from social services, and it seemed only a matter of time before Damien wouldn't be living with them any longer, either because they weren't fit to be parents or because he needed serious help from a child psychologist. I never found out what ultimately happened to Damien, but I truly hope he received the assistance he needed. I don't believe children are born evil. They're shaped by their surroundings. If his parents were any indication, Damien was raised in a very troubled environment. Hello, I'm Daniel, an assistant researcher at Vancouver State University, focusing on atmospheric science. This field examines weather and climate by connecting with other areas, like chemistry, math, and environmental engineering. Most of my recent work has revolved around climate change, but at the start of this year, I joined a unique research initiative with Almaty University in Kazakhstan. Our task was to translate and validate previously unreleased research data, recently obtained from the Kazakh government. To understand why this job was assigned to us, a bit of context is necessary. Unlike some former Soviet nations that faced chaos during the USSR's fall, Kazakhstan quickly consolidated power under a leader named Nursultan. Sultan was, to put it mildly, eccentric. He did things like renaming Kazakhstan's capital after himself and importing sand from tropical beaches to make a fake resort. He also commissioned massive, peculiar skyscrapers, which appear empty and serve no purpose other than creating a futuristic vibe for Almaty, or Nur-Sultan, as the city was once named. When the Soviets withdrew, Sultan and his allies secured control over all government properties, including scientific research stations built across the USSR. While former Soviet territories gradually shared research data with Western institutions, Kazakhstan did not. Sultan hoarded all research information, supposedly to protect it from Western espionage. Whether he was actually guarding national interests or just asserting his power, most of the Soviet-era data stayed classified until he resigned in 2022. Once he stepped down, two of Kazakhstan's top universities, one now bearing Sultan's name, gained custody of the data and shared it with Almaty University, which then granted us access at Vancouver State. First, we needed clearance to access these materials, but the second challenge lay in determining the credibility of the data. Soviet science, especially in atmospheric research, often lagged in areas like agriculture and biology due to the influence of ideology, which sometimes replaced solid science with unreliable conclusions. One notorious example is the Soviet agricultural scientist Trofim Lysenko, whose flawed theories led to widespread famine. Lysenko manipulated data to support his claims, using misleading statistics and small sample sizes to enforce disastrous farming policies across the USSR and later China. Many scientists who dared to contradict him faced harsh penalties or even imprisonment. My task involved identifying such biases in Soviet research and comparing it to more reliable Western studies to decide if it was credible. Sifting through this data was tedious. Atmospheric research can sometimes lead to exciting travel, but in this case, my journey was mainly from my desk to the coffee maker. I reviewed hundreds of reports, most of which were basic studies on climate patterns. I relied heavily on coffee and aspirin to keep myself alert. Then, among the stacks of papers, I found two reports that immediately stood out. These documents covered a recovery mission for valuable equipment at a remote Kazakh research site in what is now Banai province. The facility was abandoned in the 1970s following an extreme weather event, severe enough to prompt an immediate evacuation. The first report I read addressed the problem. The facility housed valuable equipment that could not be retrieved because helicopters couldn't access the site due to continuous hazardous weather. Railways serving the area had been closed, so the only way to reach the site was a 2-day hike across frozen tundra. While reading, I pictured this team of Soviet scientists trudging through the icy wilderness on a challenging, possibly dangerous mission. However, the report didn't make complete sense. It seemed unlikely that 6 researchers could transport heavy equipment and documents through such rugged terrain. I wondered if this mission was actually to assess the impact of the extreme weather event. The second report proposed a solution to the issue but left many unanswered questions. After combing through piles of paperwork and asking colleagues to look for any follow-up reports, I found nothing mentioning the Banai mission after the proposed start date of November 14, 1974. The names of the researchers assigned to the mission, like Igor Smirnov and Farad Zhukov, disappeared from all documents after that date, as if they simply vanished. I flagged the reports as inconclusive and asked our contacts at Almaty University for additional records, but none were found. Still, the mystery lingered, so I did some research on my own. A natural gas company, Kaznak Gas, now operates the Banai site, but this company has no online presence, social media, or stock listings. After weeks of piecing things together, I could only form a theory. Though this remains speculative, I believe that an unusually powerful atmospheric event struck the Banai site, but not an ordinary snowstorm. It was likely some intense electromagnetic or electrical storm, severe enough to disable helicopters. The Kazakh government likely sent scientists to survey the damage, but I think the mission encountered something more disastrous, resulting in their disappearance. People may dismiss this as wild conjecture, but as an atmospheric scientist, I see too many loose ends to ignore. Whatever occurred in Benai was likely kept secret, similar to how the Soviet government handled the Chernobyl disaster years later. With Chernobyl, they couldn't keep the cover, but they might have succeeded with Benai. What worries me is the possibility that this site, like Chernobyl, could still be hazardous. Kazakhstan's government might need to contain it, and if they fail, the consequences could be catastrophic. When asked if people should fear climate change, I often say there are other hidden dangers we should worry about, mysteries that could bring disaster far faster than we realize. During the summer between finishing my A-levels and starting university, I traveled to the United States as part of the Camp America program. For those unfamiliar, it's an exchange initiative that helps Europeans secure positions as camp counselors in the US. You pay a fee and they arrange a job for you at a camp in your preferred region, whether it's the East Coast, West Coast, or Southwest. You get the idea. I ended up at a camp near Malibu, California, which is one of the most stunning places I've ever seen. Most of my experiences there were amazing, and I have no regrets, but one child who attended the camp turned out to be one of the creepiest individuals I've ever encountered. Not only that, but he did something truly horrifying right before my eyes. We started to notice something unusual about a boy named Tyler when we observed him whispering to himself. One of the other counselors mentioned that she had asked him once, "Who are you talking to, Tyler?" His answer was completely unexpected and deeply unsettling. She had anticipated a response like, "No one," or "my imaginary friend," something innocent. Instead, he firmly denied whispering anything at all, leaving her at a loss for words. She followed up by telling him she had seen him whispering and reassured him that it was okay and he didn't need to deny it. Tyler then got surprisingly defensive, acting as though she was foolish for even asking, and again completely denied that he had been whispering. The bizarre part was how genuine he seemed, showing real indignation and frustration in his tone as he refuted her claims. At that point, it shifted from amusing to downright eerie. What if he truly didn't realize he was whispering? Maybe it was some sort of unconscious reflex. Regardless, we all became acutely aware that Tyler was not your typical child. One evening, I was asked if I knew any spooky campfire stories to share with the kids. I ended up telling them a simplified version of Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf, which happens to be one of my favorite short stories. It's a good little mystery with a solid twist at the end, so the kids were engrossed. After I finished, as they chatted about how great the story was, little Tyler suddenly exclaimed, "I'm a werewolf," with pride. The other kids immediately countered, "No, you're not, Tyler. Werewolves aren't real." But Tyler insisted he was, claiming they were wrong because he was one of them. The other kids began teasing him, and I recognized that same sincerity in him that my fellow counselor had noticed. He clearly wasn't a werewolf, but he spoke as if he truly believed he was one, like he felt it in his heart. I understood what my fellow counselor meant when she described how unsettling Tyler could be, but the truly terrifying moment didn't occur until later that night. The campfire storytelling was part of a trail camping excursion we organized with the kids, where we took them into the surrounding hills with camping gear so they could experience the outdoors. Because of that, when it was bedtime, I was much closer to the children than I would have been if we were back at camp in our separate cabins. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard a high-pitched scream close by. Since we were in a small valley, the scream echoed through the hills, heightening the fear. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, threw on my boots, and shone my flashlight around to figure out where the scream was coming from. It wasn't hard to pinpoint. It was the only tent with its zip and flap wide open, and I could see one of the kids' rear ends sticking out. I rushed over to see what was happening, thinking it might be some sort of spider or large bug that had gotten inside. What I witnessed next was one of the most chilling and haunting images I'd ever seen. The child who had half crawled into another kid's tent backed up a bit, still on all fours, and turned to face the light of my flashlight. It was Tyler, with a wide, maniacal grin on his face, blood smeared across his lips, chin, and teeth. What followed was a surreal moment where I realized what had happened. It was obvious, but I didn't want to accept it. No matter how much I wished it weren't true, it didn't change the fact that Tyler had bitten one of the kids who had mocked him, cutting into the meat of the child's leg. I sprinted back to my tent to grab the first aid kit and my phone. While on a speaker call with another counselor, fear gripped me, thinking Tyler might attack me next. It turned out he had fled into the hills, probably scared of the consequences of his actions. When I suggested that another counselor and I go look for him, the camp leader flatly said no and instructed us to let the police handle it. We all knew something was off with Tyler. We just didn't realize he was the most disturbed and dangerously violent kid any of us had ever encountered. I can vouch for every counselor on that, even those who had worked at several summer camps over the years. Don't quote me on this, but I think he eventually ended up in some kind of facility for troubled youth. I know the camp I worked for ended up getting sued by the parents of the bitten child for negligence, which turned into their own financial nightmare. Meanwhile, I was left with my very own horror story about Tyler, the boy who thought he was a werewolf. I went camping with my friends, Nate, Oliver, and Mark, the summer after we finished high school. We had been close friends throughout most of our school years. Our other friend, Josh, couldn't join us because he had started college the previous year and was still away. We had all been camping before, but not in this specific location. We were warned to be cautious of bears, but we weren't too worried since we all knew bear safety well. Nate even brought along his rifle just in case. We had heard from one of our teachers that the campsite we picked was stunning and tranquil, with a beautiful lake and plenty of hiking paths. Excited, we drove to the site and then hiked in for about 3 hours since there was no car access. The hike wasn't tough. You could probably manage it on a four-wheeler if you had good skills. But we didn't have one, so we hiked. We carried our tents, sleeping bags, and supplies on our backs. The trail was picturesque, and we joked and chatted all the way. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were chirping happily. We spotted some bear droppings, but it didn't bother us. In fact, we were eager to see a bear. When we reached our campsite with plenty of daylight left, we were amazed by its beauty. We found a nice spot by the lake and set up our tents among the trees, which provided plenty of shade. The water was crystal clear, and we could see fish occasionally leaping. After gathering some firewood, we built a fire. Feeling adventurous, I decided to explore the area, and Mark joined me. We hiked for a few hours, soaking in the stunning scenery. As we walked, we found more signs of bears, including scratch marks on trees and large piles of droppings. We began to feel a bit uneasy but reassured ourselves that we'd be fine as long as we didn't do anything foolish. Upon returning to our campsite, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. By then, Nate and Oliver had hoisted what remained of our food high in a tree to keep it away from any bears. That's really the minimum you need to do in such situations. We stayed up, lounging around the fire. It was a perfect night so far. We eventually went to bed around 3 a.m. I fell asleep the moment I lay down. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. Confused and disoriented, I sat up in my tent, which was still dim as if the sun was just beginning to rise. Checking my phone, I saw that it was 5:20 a.m. I heard loud growling noises and peeked out of my tent to see a massive bear tearing apart Oliver's tent. Oliver was screaming and trying to escape. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. I got out of my tent and stood there, wanting to help my friend but knowing I couldn't. Then, Nate sprang up, grabbed his rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air, causing the bear to vanish. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and my ears rang. I looked at Nate, who still held his rifle. He looked pale and shaken. In that moment, we realized we needed to leave the campsite immediately. We packed up our gear and hurried down the trail, with Nate clutching the rifle the entire way. We were too frightened to remain in the area, even though we had planned to stay for 3 more nights. We hiked back to our car as quickly as we could, not wanting to look back or think about what could have happened if Nate hadn't scared the bear away. Once we reached our car, we drove to the nearest ranger station and reported the bear encounter. The ranger told us we were fortunate to have escaped and reminded us to always be cautious when camping in bear territory. We drove to a nearby town and found an inexpensive motel for the night. We spent hours discussing the incident and how lucky we were to be alive. Nate emerged looking like a hero, and honestly, he deserved it. This took place a few summers back during a camping trip I went on with my close friends, Jake, Leo, and Sam. Leo knew about a secluded area deep in the woods that his uncle had shown him. Both he and Sam were seasoned outdoorsmen, but Jake and I were less experienced. It was several hours away from our town, and we made the trip in Leo's dad's old SUV. The drive was full of winding roads and steep inclines, and by the time we arrived, the place's beauty hit me hard. From where we parked, it was at least a 2-hour hike to the camping spot. We didn't see another person for miles, and it felt like we were completely on our own out there. The site was surrounded by thick woods, and a narrow stream flowed nearby. We set up our tents and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. Although it wasn't a formal campsite, the area was somewhat established, with a fire pit already there. When night settled in, we built a fire and relaxed, cooking dinner and sharing a few beers we'd brought along. We'd only managed to carry in 1 6-pack, so that's all we had. Conversation flowed smoothly, and we were all in high spirits. We finally turned in around 1 a.m. and each crawled into our individual tents, which we'd set up side by side on the only flat patch of ground available. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, somewhere around 3:30 a.m., to a sound of movement in the bushes. At first, I assumed it was an animal, but as I listened, the footsteps sounded human. Frozen in place, I lay there listening to the faint sounds, uncertain what to do. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep and woke up at dawn. I didn't mention what I'd heard to the others, partly because I wasn't sure if I dreamed it. We spent the day hiking and had a pretty good time, but when we returned to the site, we noticed something strange. Jake's lighter and a small knife were missing. He'd left them by the fire pit, and we all looked at each other, puzzled. Who could have taken them? We hadn't seen a single person since we arrived. As the sun began to set, a sense of unease settled over me. I felt like we were being watched, but I kept it to myself. I didn't want to make the others nervous. We went to bed again around midnight, and like the night before, I woke up around 3. This time, it was because I needed to step outside. As I looked up at the sky, the full moon was so bright I could see well into the woods. That's when I noticed a figure, a man walking slowly in the distance. He moved with an odd, dragging step, and his clothes were torn, and he was barefoot. I wanted to hide, but there wasn't anywhere to go. He turned his head, and our eyes met. The look he gave me sent a chill down my spine. He even smiled, but it was far from comforting. It didn't make sense that someone would be out here so isolated and in that condition. I hurried back to the tents and woke the others to tell them what I'd seen. They were all uneasy but agreed we should wait until morning to leave. We huddled around the fire, talking in low voices. Every rustle in the bushes had us on edge. The footsteps returned a few times through the night, though we never saw the man again. When the morning finally arrived, we all agreed it was best to pack up and head out. Even though we had planned to stay one more day, none of us felt comfortable. The 3-hour hike back was tense, and hardly anyone spoke. Relief washed over us once we reached the SUV, feeling safe at last. We never found out who that man was, but Jake never got his knife or lighter back, which left us unsettled. Knowing that the stranger had taken them made us realize he was probably watching us all along. Later, when Leo shared the story with his uncle, he was just as surprised. He'd camped at that spot countless times and had never seen anyone else out there. It left us with a mystery we still can't explain. Nearly 2 decades ago, I was eager for a camping trip I'd planned with friends. My buddies, Rachel, Mike, Tyler, and I needed a break from the city, so we packed up and headed to a secluded state park in southern Michigan. We were excited about being surrounded by nature for a few days. With our gear packed and the car loaded, we hit the road, ready for adventure. Our destination was a large park known for its thick, green woods. When we arrived, we parked near the visitor center and began our trek into the forest. The trail wasn't long, but the path was rough, and the dense trees blocked most of the afternoon sunlight, making it feel later than it was. Hiking here would be nearly impossible in the dark, even with flashlights. After a couple of hours, we found a good camping spot beside a serene lake. We built a campfire, cooked some food, and swapped stories as the sky filled with stars. It was a picture-perfect night to kick off our trip. The following day, we explored nearby trails and found another beautiful lake, where we spent the afternoon swimming in the refreshing water. We made it back to our campsite by evening, prepared dinner, and enjoyed another night under the stars. But that night took a strange turn. As we sat around the campfire, we noticed a light across the lake. We hadn't seen anyone else around, so the glow surprised us. It looked like another campfire on the opposite shore. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down toward the lake. As we got closer, we realized the light was indeed from a campfire across the water. Relieved to think it was just another group of campers, we turned back toward our fire. But just then, something in the water caught our attention, freezing us in place. A body was drifting toward the shore. In the faint light, we could see it was a woman, her eyes staring lifelessly up at the sky. We were all terrified. Tyler was shaking as he whispered, "We should pull her out." Rachel, ever the practical one, hissed, "No way, don't touch her. It'll mess up any evidence." "Haven't you seen a crime show?" Tyler backed off, realizing we all agreed with Rachel. But we were stuck. Without cell service, we couldn't call for help, and we couldn't hike out safely at night. The thought that this might be a murder sent a chill through us. If so, was the person responsible still nearby? At that thought, I quickly put out our fire, covering the coals with dirt to avoid detection. Glancing across the lake, I saw that the other campfire had vanished. Whoever was over there had extinguished it, too. We spent a sleepless night, taking turns keeping watch. Every rustle and shadow had us on edge. In the morning light, the reality hit harder. Seeing the body in daylight was surreal, far worse than in the dark. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream, but the sun made it real. Without wasting time, we hiked back to the nearest ranger station to report what we'd seen. The police came, combing the lake, and found the body, a young woman who had been missing for days. They questioned us all, piecing together any details that might help, but nothing added up. No one had seen or heard anything that pointed to the person responsible. We told them about the campfire across the lake, but park records showed no one else was registered in that area. We were certain we'd seen others, but the authorities couldn't track anyone down. As time passed, the case went unsolved, and they never found the person responsible. The experience stuck with us, and over time, our once close group slowly drifted apart. Even now, I think back to that night. The woman's blank gaze into the sky haunts me. I wonder who could have done such a terrible thing and if they're still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to wander into the wrong place at the wrong time. When I was about 11 or 12, my best buddy, Sam, would spend a couple of weeks at summer camp every year. That stretch was always the dullest part of my summer since we usually spent most of our vacation days together. After a lot of pleading, I finally convinced my parents to let me join Sam at camp one year. Money was pretty tight at home, so it wasn't an easy ask, but they eventually agreed, thinking it would be good for me. We headed out on a bright Saturday morning, with Sam's parents giving me a ride since they were taking him up to camp anyway. I was beyond excited, eager to see all the things Sam had described over the years. Still, I was also a bit anxious since I'd never really been far from home for more than a night. As we pulled up, I saw several log cabins scattered in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, with one big cabin that looked like the main lodge where the camp director worked. It was the kind of scene you'd see on a postcard, complete with babbling brooks and crisp, clean air. We were really in the wilderness. When we arrived, a few counselors greeted us. They seemed friendly and weren't that much older than us, maybe 16 or 17. It did feel a bit risky leaving a bunch of kids in the middle of nowhere, but kids had been going to camps like this for generations, so a little independence didn't seem like a bad thing. The first few days were a whirlwind of getting settled, playing games, swimming, and canoeing on the nearby lake. Typical camp stuff. I started feeling more comfortable and my initial worries faded. After our first week, the counselors announced a 2-night hiking trip. We'd be sleeping out under the stars and putting our camp skills to the test. As we hiked deeper into the forest, they entertained us with tales from past camps, including an old legend. Supposedly, there used to be a prison nearby, and years ago, a convict escaped from there. One counselor told us this man was deeply disturbed. He had even lost a hand while trying to climb over a barbed wire fence, replacing it with a wooden prosthetic. After escaping, he hid in these woods, but was never caught. Though no one had seen him for ages, some claimed to have spotted him recently. Of course, by now, he'd be in his 90s if he were still alive, surviving in the wild on bugs and roots. I didn't really buy the story, thinking it was just something the counselors made up to scare us. But Sam seemed to believe it a bit, even though we both agreed it was unlikely anyone was out there. That night, we set up camp and everyone quickly fell asleep, except Sam and me. Just as I lay down, Sam leaned over and whispered, "Hey, get up. I saw something back there." It looked like an old shack in the woods. Reluctantly, I got out of my sleeping bag and followed him. Our flashlights barely pierced through the thick brush as we made our way through fallen branches and underbrush. The counselor's story played on my mind, making me a bit uneasy. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and there it was, a worn-down shack standing in the moonlight. We looked at each other with a mix of excitement and curiosity. The place looked abandoned, so we didn't worry much about trespassing. The windows were shattered, the door was hanging by a hinge, and the roof had a huge hole in it. Inside, the shack was a wreck, which wasn't surprising. But what really got us were the carvings on the walls, strange symbols and eerie drawings that looked like some kind of ritual had taken place there. While creepy, it didn't feel dangerous, so we kept exploring. Sam moved to check another room while I examined the symbols. Suddenly, I heard him whisper, "Come here." His face was pale as I approached, and when I looked where he was pointing, I felt a chill. There, in the middle of the floor, was a wooden hand. That was enough for us. We bolted out of the shack and didn't stop running until we were back at our camp. Crawling into our sleeping bags, we lay awake until dawn, too shaken to sleep. We never told anyone about what we saw. Part of me thinks it was all just an elaborate prank, set up by the counselors to scare curious campers. But then again, it seemed too complex and too isolated for that. Whatever the truth, I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled upon something truly unsettling that night, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I went on a camping trip with my cousins Brian and Marissa. Growing up, our families used to go every year, but now that we're older, it had been a while since our last trip. We decided to explore a remote national park close to where we lived, known for its wild, rugged landscape. The hike was a long, exhausting 3 hours, but as we pushed further into the forest, we didn't come across a single person. We set up camp just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Sitting around the campfire, we roasted marshmallows and swapped stories. The only sounds were the crackling flames and an occasional owl hooting. It felt incredibly peaceful and calming, a nice escape from the stresses of everyday life. But that calm didn't last. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise in the distance. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick. We all froze, exchanging worried glances. "Did you hear that?" Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's a bear," I suggested. After some hushed discussion, I decided to go check it out. I had more experience in the outdoors. I'd worked as a camp guide and had taken a few wilderness safety courses. I grabbed the brightest flashlight and cautiously headed toward the sound. I kept the light off for a bit since the moonlight was bright enough, hoping to confirm it was an animal before scaring it off. As I moved closer, my heart pounded. I saw a shadowy figure standing in the woods. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a man, his back turned to me. I quickly ducked behind a tree, staying hidden in case he turned around. After what felt like forever, the figure slipped away into the trees. I hurried back to our campsite, my heart still racing. "There's someone out there," I told them, my voice shaking. "I saw a man in the woods. He didn't see me, but he was definitely there." We all exchanged nervous glances, a mix of fear and confusion on our faces. "What's going on?" Marissa asked quietly. We decided to call it a night, but I couldn't sleep. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened intently to the sounds around us. All night, I heard faint footsteps moving around our campsite. I stayed still, too frightened to move or see what was out there. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but it felt too real. Eventually, dawn broke, and I felt a wave of relief. I peeked out of my tent and walked around the campsite. Right away, we noticed signs that someone had been there during the night. Although nothing was missing, there were fresh cigarette butts scattered around, and none of us smoked. Even more unsettling, there was a small burn hole in the fabric of one of my cousin's tents, which hadn't been there before. We packed up quickly, nerves frayed as we trekked back through the woods, feeling as if unseen eyes were watching us. When we reported the incident back at the ranger station, they shrugged it off, suggesting it was just some passing hikers. But I knew what I saw, and deep down, I was certain we'd stumbled into something eerie in those woods. Photography has always been a passion of mine. I'd always dreamed of doing it full-time, and a few years back, I finally took the plunge and left my regular job. The start was nerve-wracking. I wasn't sure if I could make enough to cover my expenses. In the beginning, there were a few months where I barely made it, but in time, things began to improve and I've never looked back. One of my most profitable ventures has been capturing nature. Landscapes, animals, really anything unique that catches my eye. A few times each year, I go on a week-long trek in the wilderness, taking thousands of photos along the way. Out of all those shots, I usually end up with a few hundred that turn out amazing. I make my living by licensing these images to businesses, websites, and even for TV and movies. On one of these trips, something happened that I will never forget. I had planned a solo hike through the forests of Oregon. I'd heard about a spot there, known for having some of the most breathtaking views imaginable. Getting there was supposed to be extremely challenging, a 3-day hike each way through rugged terrain with no vehicle access at all. That was fine by me. I liked the idea of a difficult journey. If it were easy to reach, everyone would go, and my work wouldn't stand out as much. The scenery was stunning as I made my way in. Around every corner, there seemed to be another postcard-worthy view. Rolling hills, waterfalls, and I even spotted a full-grown elk, the first I'd ever seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stopped to set up camp. My first memory card was already packed with great shots, and the following days were equally productive. There was no noise other than the breeze through the trees and the occasional birdsong. I felt very much alone. Not many people ventured this far in, and there was something eerie about it. I realized that bringing a partner might have been wise, but I didn't know anyone willing to take a week off just to walk for days on end. One evening, as dusk was settling in, I had already set up camp and was wandering around, hoping to capture a few more good shots before nightfall. That's when I heard it, a sound like footsteps. At first, I assumed it was a deer, but as I followed the noise, I started to doubt that. Deer move gently, carefully placing each hoof to stay quiet and avoid attracting predators. This sound was more like a steady, dragging walk, as if a person were moving and slightly scraping their feet with each step. The sound grew louder as I followed it until, through the thick bushes, I saw something that shocked and unsettled me. There was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, slowly walking through the forest. She wore a spotless, flowing white dress and high-heeled shoes. Her hair was styled as if she were going to a formal event, and her makeup was perfect for such an occasion. She had no backpack or supplies with her, just a small white purse that matched her dress, trailing behind her. I should have felt the urge to help her, but something about the situation seemed off. There was a calmness around her, as though she belonged exactly where she was. I know it sounds odd, but that was the feeling I had in that moment, a sense that this was her place. I stood there for several minutes, watching as she slowly vanished into the distance. A few more minutes passed, and the sound of her footsteps faded completely. With the last bit of daylight, I made my way back to my campsite. I ended up sitting by the fire all night, unable to sleep, poking at the embers and thinking about what I'd seen. Part of me half expected to see her again, but she never reappeared. By morning, I decided to start my hike back out. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. There was no way she could have reached that remote spot without making the same 3-day hike I had, and to do it in high heels without any food or water seemed nearly impossible. I might never understand what I saw or why I didn't approach her. All I know is I really wish I'd taken a photo. A few years back, when I was around 23, I had an unsettling experience while camping. I live in a scenic area full of dense woods. I won't say exactly where, but imagine plenty of trees and rugged trails. Growing up, I'd often go camping in the wilderness surrounding my town. Being in Scouts from a young age, I'd gotten pretty comfortable outdoors. Even though it had been a few years since high school, I still hung out with a couple of close friends from those days, Alex and Ben. We had a strong bond. Alex had been in Scouts with me and shared my passion for nature, while Ben was more of a city person. He still loved coming along whenever we'd invite him for camping trips. So the three of us decided to go camping for a weekend near the end of summer, around early September. The weather was still warm enough that we didn't need much, just my old tent and some blankets. That Saturday, we packed up Alex's truck and set out without a specific destination in mind. I'd camped in the area countless times, so I was comfortable finding a spot along the way. Around 11 a.m., we stumbled upon a great campsite not far from the road, and with a little effort, we managed to drive the truck in over rocks and tree roots. Alex's truck had four-wheel drive, so it handled the rough ground. Ben, who wasn't keen on sleeping outdoors, claimed the truck's back seat, while Alex and I took the tent. We spent a few hours setting up. I pitched the tent while Ben gathered firewood, and Alex impressed us by crafting a small table using logs and an old plywood board we found nearby. Once camp was ready, we decided to explore the area on foot. By about 2 or 3 p.m., we started hiking. Not much happened on our hike, though we did find a secluded lake with marshy edges that kept us from wading in. One strange thing, though, we spotted fresh footprints that didn't belong to any of us. It was surprising, given how remote the area was, but it was public land, so it wasn't out of the question that someone else might be nearby. But when we returned to our campsite, my heart sank. There, in the middle of Alex's table, was a large hunting knife with a wooden handle and a strip of yellow tape around it. I turned to Alex and asked, "Is that your knife?" One look at him told me he was just as shocked as I was. Whoever had been there didn't seem to have good intentions. Our next move was clear: we needed to leave, and fast. We jumped into the truck without packing up, but just as Alex started the engine, we realized there was another problem. The tires were flat. I got out to check, and it was obvious someone had slashed them, likely with the same knife now sticking out of our table. With no other option, we left everything behind and started running. The truck had been about a half-hour drive from the main road, which meant a long trek on foot. Adrenaline kicked in, and we kept moving without looking back. Eventually, we reached the main road, exhausted but relieved. Just then, a passing truck came into view, and Ben waved it down. We explained our situation to the driver, who graciously let us hop in the back. As we began driving away, a wave of relief washed over me. But just then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a dark figure standing by the edge of the trees. He was in a large hooded sweatshirt, obscuring his face, and he was holding a knife, the very same knife we'd found at our campsite. My buddy and I planned a camping trip, and since neither of us had any experience, we reserved an easy campsite with all the conveniences we could think of. We packed up all the necessary items and more. When we arrived, we noticed that our assigned campsite already had a tent there, but it looked ancient and appeared to have been up for weeks. It was pretty worn down. There was a fire pit, a backpack, and several other camping supplies. We went to the office to inquire about it, but they claimed they had no idea what we were referring to. We led them back to the location, but everything had vanished. All the gear was gone. It was only a 10-minute walk back to the office, so there was no way someone could have packed everything up and left without leaving a single trace. The staff suggested we must have been mistaken about our spot, but we were both confident we had gone to the same place. We tried to put it out of our minds and set up our tent, which took longer than it probably should have since, as I mentioned, we were both new to this. As night began to fall, we started to prepare a fire and brought out some marshmallows. I know it sounds cliché, but you can't go camping without roasting marshmallows. We sat around the fire chatting and enjoying a few treats before getting ready for bed once the flames died down. When we were all snuggled in, we began to hear footsteps behind us. We tried to convince ourselves it was an animal, but the steps were heavy. I figured most creatures would move quietly. We just lay there in silence, probably too frightened to budge. After a few moments, the footsteps seemed to circle around us. They then sounded like they were moving away, so we decided to peek out, and my heart sank. Right in front of us was the campsite we had seen earlier, but there was no way anyone could have set it up so quickly without us noticing. We both agreed to leave everything and run. It seemed foolish at that moment, but we hadn't even brought a phone or a flashlight. We sprinted to the office, and the park ranger came with us. But when we returned, everything was gone again. The eerie campsite and ours. The ranger was just as shocked, having never witnessed anything like that before. To this day, we still have no explanation for what happened, and we both agreed we would never go camping again. I took a solo camping trip into the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in Georgia. There was a secluded trail I had been hoping to hike, and I finally decided to go for it. It would be a 3-day trek with 2 nights out on the trail. I felt excited for the journey and the chance to escape city life for a bit. The first day went smoothly. I only saw one other hiker, and we passed each other with barely more than a nod. I soaked up the mountain scenery and enjoyed the quiet solitude. Around sunset, I found a spot to camp. It was slightly off the path in a small, open area, a well-used campsite with a tidy fire ring set up. I pitched my tent, had dinner, and then went to sleep. I never sleep through the night when I'm out camping. I tend to wake up every few hours. During one of those times, I noticed a shadow moving near my campsite. It was clearly a person. I stayed perfectly still, and after a while, they wandered off. I couldn't fall back asleep, though. My mind buzzed with questions. Who was out there, and why? The next morning, I packed up early, ate a quick breakfast, and continued down the trail, still unsettled by the night's visitor. Around midday, I noticed a man up ahead. I was about to greet him, but he disappeared into the bushes. I hesitated, worried about passing that spot. It might have been a trap. I called out, but there was no answer. Finally, I decided to keep moving. As I approached where I'd seen him, someone leapt out from behind a tree. He looked rough. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes had a wild glint. I managed to break free and ran as fast as I could. Later, I reported the attack, and a search party was dispatched, but they never found him. What haunts me the most is that another hiker later reported a similar encounter. They never caught the man, dead or alive. Even back in the safety of my regular life, a deep sense of dread stayed with me, a reminder of how close danger had been. I couldn't bring myself to go camping alone again or even return to that trail. The beauty of the mountains couldn't overshadow the fear and helplessness I had felt in that remote area. Back in the city, I kept replaying the hike in my mind, unable to forget his wild, intense stare. Researching the trail, I found other hikers with stories eerily similar to mine. Many recalled seeing a figure lurking in the shadows or hearing strange sounds in the night. Some had even reported missing items. With so many accounts, it's hard to believe they haven't caught him yet. It's as if he's there, always watching but seldom seen. My name is Sarah, and this took place last spring. I went on a camping trip to celebrate my friend Mark's birthday. We'd been planning it for a while, and all of us were looking forward to a weekend in the wilderness. Altogether, there were 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We packed up our supplies, loaded the car, and started our drive to the campsite. The view was incredible. Tall, green trees surrounded us, and the sky was a vivid blue, with the sun shining down as we set up our tents. That first night, we built a fire and made dinner. We spent the evening laughing and swapping scary stories as it got dark, unaware that a real nightmare was waiting for us. The next morning, we decided to go hiking. We picked a trail and admired the beauty around us. The sound of birds chirping, the peaceful atmosphere. We were enjoying each other's company, but when we returned to the campsite, it felt like someone had been there. My camping knife was missing, and one of my friends thought maybe I'd misplaced it. But I was pretty sure I'd left it in my bag, inside my tent. "Are you sure you didn't drop it on the hike?" Mark asked, looking worried. "I'm certain," I replied. "I checked it before we left." Even though I felt uneasy, we decided to stay another night. My friends tried to comfort me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Still, since everyone else wanted to stay, I agreed. The following morning, we woke up, and I'd almost forgotten about the strange feeling from the day before. We enjoyed another fun day of hiking and relaxing, but when we returned to our campsite that evening, Mark noticed his car's tires had been slashed. We were now stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home. It would take at least 5 hours to walk to the main road, where we might be able to get a ride. There was another nearby road, though less traveled, where we thought we could try our luck. We started down that gravel path, hoping to see a passing car, but we didn't come across any. As the sun was beginning to set, I glanced back and saw someone else on the road. We couldn't make out who it was, but we felt like they were watching us. Our pace quickened, but the figure kept trailing us, and fear started to take over. "Come on, let's run," Mark said, grabbing my arm. We took off, trying to distance ourselves from the person following us. When I looked back, I saw they were holding my missing knife. We sprinted down that gravel road for a while before a car finally appeared. We stood in the middle of the road, waving our arms, and it stopped to give us a ride. Once inside, the driver asked if we needed to go back for another friend. "We don't know that person," we told him. "They were following us." It felt surreal, like something out of a novel. We didn't know who they were or why they were after us, but we all agreed on one thing: we would never go camping again. To this day, we've never talked about it again, but the image of that stranger holding my knife, following us, is a memory I can't erase. The story below is completely true. The years mentioned are the estimated time frame during which the events took place. It was the only moment in my life when I questioned my own sanity and perceptions. I encourage you to read this story in its entirety because it actually has a real conclusion. I'm sharing it now because I think it's a tale from which we can all learn. This tale unfolds in a medium-sized town located about 2.5 hours southwest of Chicago, near the Iowa border. The figure in the woods was first spotted at a small park situated right in the center of town. This park is surrounded by approximately 4 to 5 acres of woods. In the early 1990s, I first heard about the woman in the woods while I was in 5th grade, hanging out with some other boys on the school grounds. It was your typical ghost story about Mill Park, our local gathering spot just a few blocks away, where a child had gone missing after witnessing the ghost, specifically a woman dressed all in white. They didn't know the child's name, but the incident supposedly occurred in 1987. Another boy chimed in, mentioning that an adult had also disappeared the night following a sighting of the same ghost a few years later. In both cases, the sightings occurred after the park had closed, well past midnight. The park lies between several neighborhoods, and there have always been accounts of people moving away after encountering the woman drifting through the woods. Over the years, I heard other stories related to witchcraft, devil worship, abductions, murders, and the occult. The tale gained traction when another boy from our class discovered a pentagram spray-painted on a tree along a path near the park a few months later. We rode our bikes out to see it, and it was definitely there, crudely painted as if done in a hurry. There was no way to tell if the pentagram was related to the legend or merely coincidental. At that age, we rarely paused to contemplate such things. We only focused on what was in front of us, and what I saw was undeniably creepy. In May 1995, a friend named Aaron, who lived just a block from Mill Park, was allowed by his parents to host a sleepover for his birthday. He invited 10 of us boys to spend the night just doing what boys do. You can guess how this story goes. Aaron was well acquainted with all the Mill Park ghost tales, living closer than any of us, and had a neighbor who supposedly shared all kinds of wild information. He recounted many of the stories we had already heard, even adding a few of his own. As the clock ticked closer to 1 a.m., one of the boys suggested we sneak out to see if we could find the ghost lady, and that's exactly what we did. We quietly made our way to Mill Park, Once there, we split into groups. Some went over to the overgrown Little League baseball field. Others headed toward the playground equipment, while Aaron and I stayed in the parking lot near his house. I wish I could tell you we did something really exciting, but in reality, we just walked around, waiting. We had been there for maybe 15 or 20 minutes when it happened. I kid you not, just like something out of a movie. There she was in the woods to my north. A pale woman with white hair, flowing white clothing, and white pants. In the night, she seemed to glow. It was a perfect representation of what one might picture as a ghost. I have never felt so terrified in my life, and to this day, it remains the most frightening moment I've ever experienced, even more so than a car accident I was in. We all saw her, 10 of us, and she stood out like a sore thumb. We took off, running faster than we had ever run before, all of us completely silent as we dashed back to Aaron's house in safety. I could embellish the story and tell you she chased us or made a move toward us, or that her head split open and bees poured out, but that didn't happen. In fact, she was facing a different direction and didn't even seem to notice we were there. She appeared to be gazing deeper into the woods instead of at us. Terrified boys fleeing. We all made it back safely, spent the night worried that the ghost lady might come to abduct us, but she never showed. Back at school, the woman in the woods became a legend. We all shared the tale, backing each other up, even telling one of our teachers. She listened politely and then changed the topic. This was the most exciting, terrifying thing that had ever happened to any of us, and we had one of the best campfire ghost stories in history. As time passed, we moved from grade school to junior high and eventually graduated high school. As we got older, the story took a backseat to girls and simply living our lives. I wouldn't say the tale died, as I know we still spoke of it occasionally, and I am aware it continued to circulate in grade school for a little while after we left. Sadly, one of the boys from the birthday party took his own life shortly after high school. It took everything in me not to connect that tragedy to the ghost story, but I truly don't think the two were linked. We all moved on to college, and I lost contact with all but one of the 10 of us, although I still have a few on Facebook. Fast forward to 2010. After returning home from college and struggling to get my life in order, I finally began to find my footing. I found a full-time job, married my now wife, got a dog, and even had a couple of kids. Eventually, we bought our first home, which just so happened to be a block away from my childhood house. I ended up in a small home just 2 streets away from Mill Park. After those wandering years, I found myself back where it all began. On my days off, I would walk my dog in the same park where the woman in the woods had once terrified me. At 27, I stood staring at the spot where I had seen that glowing lady all those years ago, trying to make sense of it all. Now older and wiser, I found myself pondering how I had seen a ghost in 6th grade along with 9 other boys, all of us witnessing the same thing. I knew it wasn't a dream, but how could we all have been dreaming collectively? I knew it wasn't my imagination either, it was genuinely there. What I witnessed was real, but my mind has a strange way of making things blurry. It's tough to articulate, but I began to doubt everything I knew. It felt real, yet at the same time it didn't. I wrestled with these thoughts, trying to unravel it all. In the summer of 2012, there I was again on a walk with my dog, coming up alongside the woods where I had seen the woman in the woods years ago. I was thinking of her and my childhood friends, wondering if they ever reflected on that moment as I did. The thought crossed my mind as I walked along a path leading out of the park. Ahead of me, a large trailer attached to a pickup truck sat in a driveway close to the wooded area. A middle-aged man was moving some items onto the trailer as I approached. He saw me and greeted me, and I returned the greeting. I struck up a little small talk and asked if he was moving. He replied that he had recently sold the house. It had belonged to his parents, and that he was preparing to close with a younger couple soon. I mentioned a few other things and was about to leave when I remembered the ghost story. I wasn't sure why I asked him, since it wasn't a typical topic for me to bring up in a casual conversation. But since his house was closest to the sighting, I needed confirmation that someone else still knew the story. I don't recall my exact words, but I basically inquired if he had ever heard the ghost tales. I will never forget his response. The man smiled and said he had indeed heard those stories before. I felt relieved because I hadn't considered how the conversation would have gone if he hadn't known what I was talking about. I then shared the brief version of the story you just read, and I could tell he was intrigued. Once I finished, he paused for a moment and then spoke. I used to live in this house before the park was built. My parents raised me here. I moved out in 1983 or 1984, and my parents haven't been back since. My father died in 1991. After that, it was just my mother. The ghost you saw? That was my mom. I stared at him, completely bewildered. He continued, "My mother had medical issues that started in the mid-80s and persisted until she passed away this past spring. The medication she was on caused her to sleepwalk. I can't even count how many times I received calls in the middle of the night from the police, informing me they found my mother wandering in the park. I learned recently that one of the neighbors moved away because they were tired of all the disturbances. My sister lives in Texas, and I could never convince her that our mom needed to be placed in an assisted living facility. So this went on for years. I discovered from some friends that my mother had become a ghost story in the park. She had a favorite robe that was entirely white, and she always wore the same pearl silk pajamas. Everything she had was white. She even had white gloves she would occasionally put on. I can only imagine what she must have looked like in the dark. Light from that lamp over there on the playground would illuminate her like a Christmas tree. It was never difficult. I've ever had with a stranger. Please bear with me. I need to set the scene for this to make sense. I live in Idaho and have spent nearly every weekend for the past decade exploring the state's West Desert. It's mostly an empty expanse filled with abandoned mines, grazing sheep, and military testing grounds. One area I love is a small mountain range near a town called Elko on the western edge of the state. I'm really passionate about this place and probably know it better than anyone else. I've hiked every major peak, explored every side canyon, and visited all the significant abandoned mines. This background is important to show how familiar I am with this region. The mountain range is next to the well-known Great Basin Desert, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a dry lake bed spanning about 50 square miles. It's one of the few vast, open spaces on Earth that hosts annual races where land speed records have been achieved at nearly 800 miles per hour. When races aren't happening, you can drive anywhere on the flats. It's an incredible experience to camp there when the wind is calm, which I often do, usually alone. My friends aren't as keen on exploring as I am. There's a particular spot on the flats where I enjoy camping. It's as secluded as you can get, literally 10 miles from the nearest road with no sagebrush or even rocks. You'd instinctively avoid anyone else you might see out there. You never know why they're there. Could be transporting illegal goods, hiding something, or who knows? It's just safer to be cautious. That said, I've never had any trouble in all the years I've been doing this. I've never heard of any incidents, and no one else has come within miles of me. On the quietest nights, you can hear a car approaching from several miles away. On August 31st, 2021, I headed to my usual camping spot, where it was a scorching 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I had a large orange sunshade set up next to my truck. It was so quiet that day it felt almost surreal. The heat had baked the salty ground until it curled up into crunchy textures that made satisfying noises as I walked. I didn't see a single car on the horizon all day. The only sound was the faint rumble of a train nearly 10 miles away. Around 7 p.m., I took a nap under my sunshade and woke up naturally about an hour later. I stood up to stretch and slowly turned around, taking in the 360-degree view for any signs of life. There was nothing. The sun was about to set behind the mountains, and it was still bright enough to see clearly. With the temperature still around 100 degrees and complete silence, I was wearing a bright blue shirt and carried a small handgun in a chest holster for safety, accessible and visible in case I encountered any trouble while hiking. I started chopping up some wood I brought for a campfire, just about 30 feet from my truck and sunshade. Suddenly, as I was chopping, I heard something behind me that sounded like the fabric of my sunshade rustling. It took my mind a moment to process because I hadn't heard anything else all day. The air was dead calm that I quickly turned around and saw a girl standing there. I froze, my blood running cold. She was maybe 50 yards away, walking somewhat toward my camp but slightly off to the side, moving in the direction of the wilderness. The noise I heard was actually her footsteps crunching on the salty ground I had mentioned earlier. She wasn't looking directly at me. She was just walking at a steady pace. She looked to be around 18, wearing a homemade tie-dye shirt and denim shorts, along with Converse sneakers, not exactly suitable for hiking. She didn't have any water, a backpack, a hat, or even sunglasses as she walked toward the setting sun in that intense heat. She didn't seem disheveled or tired at all, which made it hard to comprehend what was happening. For several seconds, I quickly scanned the horizon behind her for anyone else. A person, a vehicle, anything. But there was nothing, just her. I stood up, put down the axe, and blurted something silly like, "It's a hot day for a walk, right? Is everything okay?" I was trembling, completely baffled by how she had gotten so close without me hearing or seeing her approach. She was now almost next to my truck and simply pointed behind her with her thumb in a strange, indifferent manner. There was nothing behind her for miles. She continued walking past my camp toward the mountain range to the northwest. I was so taken aback by the unexpected human contact in such a remote place that I couldn't think of what to say. By the time I thought to offer her some water or ask if she was all right, she was almost 150 yards away, yet I could still hear her footsteps crunching as if she were right next to me. I grabbed my binoculars and watched her closely as she continued on. I half expected her to disappear like a mirage or for me to wake up from this surreal experience. I sat against my truck for a full 15 minutes, never taking my eyes off her through the binoculars. She never once looked back at me or changed her pace. By this point, she had to have been nearly a mile away, and I could still hear her footsteps clearly. As the sun set, she began to fade into the shadows of the distant mountains. Then I heard a phone ring. I didn't have cell service myself, but through the binoculars, I saw her reach into her pocket. I could even make out the faint sound of her talking. She was on the phone for maybe a minute and continued walking. About a minute later, I suddenly heard a car approaching behind me. I turned around to see headlights on the opposite horizon, maybe 3 miles away, coming straight toward me. The engine noise was loud, and they were driving quickly. I started to feel paranoid, thinking this might be some sort of setup or reconnaissance on my camp. I crouched down behind my truck and waited. It looked like they were driving right at me at high speed. A minute later, a vehicle flew past my camp, stirring up a massive dust cloud in its wake, heading in the direction of that girl. It was a late 90s Range Rover. Despite all their windows being down and being only 50 yards away, they were traveling at least 50 miles per hour. It was getting dark, so I couldn't see any faces inside. I lost sight of the girl shortly after. A little while later, I saw the taillights where I had last seen her. I watched as the brake lights flickered, then the headlights came on again, and the brake lights repeated, almost like they were spinning donuts on the salt flats. Then I saw the headlights again, and I heard the engine rev up loudly. They were racing back toward me again. I took cover behind my truck once more, chambering around because I felt certain I was about to be messed with. A minute later, the same thing happened. They sped past my camp in the direction they had come from, even faster this time. It felt like some kind of signal or message directed at me. I thought about how dangerous it was. I could have had a child or a dog running around. After a couple of minutes, the taillights disappeared over the horizon, heading back toward town. I was left wondering what to think. None of what I had seen was technically illegal, but it made no sense at all. What was that girl doing out there, 10 miles on foot from anything? I briefly thought she might be some kind of endurance athlete training for a race, but she was too young and wasn't dressed for it. She had no supplies. Maybe she had an argument with her family or friends and had stomped away for a bit. I couldn't fathom why she approached my camp with a stranger me, swinging an axe and wearing a gun. How did I not see or hear her until she was practically next to me? Was she in trouble or worse? Why didn't she ask for help or show any sign of distress? Perhaps she intended to, but changed her mind as she got closer. I really doubted she would have come that close if she was in trouble. Since I had no cell service, I couldn't report what I saw, and I knew the chances of being able to pinpoint their location or provide any useful details to a sheriff patrolling 15 miles away were slim. I decided to move my camp. I figured they might return, having marked my location. I set up again about 10 miles away, higher up in the foothills of the mountains, hoping for cell service there, but still nothing. The story ended on a disappointing note. I went to bed and called the sheriff the next morning when I got back to town. I shared my experience and the girl's description, but they didn't seem too concerned, and I've never heard anything else about it since. During my years in college, I had a buddy whose father owned a vast piece of land in East Texas, around 800 acres. In the past, he had rented it out to hunters and paper companies, but he stopped doing that. A few years earlier, he had constructed a cabin on the property and would let us visit it occasionally to unwind. It was a great escape from the stresses of school and a way to enjoy nature. During spring break in 1997, we packed our trucks and drove to the cabin. Our plan was to shoot guns, drink beer, and partake in the typical activities that people like us enjoy in the wilderness. On our first morning, we busied ourselves with cleaning the cabin and moving our belongings inside. By dinner time, we started a big fire outside and grilled some steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and cracked open a few beers. The sun set not long after, and we spent the rest of the evening drinking and sharing a joint or two. At some point that night, I heard a rustling noise outside and decided to check it out. The fire was nearly out, and just beyond its dim light, I thought I could make out a figure standing perfectly still. From what I could see, it seemed to be facing me, as if waiting to see how I would react. I blinked hard, trying to get a clearer view, but the darkness and my position made it hard to see clearly. The figure remained motionless, so I bravely took a couple of steps closer, hoping for a better look. I was terrified, yet somehow captivated by this being. Maybe I was just too drunk to make good decisions. Just as I was about to take another step, I heard a voice behind me. My friend had woken up, noticed the door wide open, and came outside to see me standing near the fire. His voice startled me, but I quickly recognized who it was. I asked if he saw the figure by the fire pit, and he just laughed, saying I must be so high I was imagining things. We both laughed it off and went back to bed. On my way, I turned around for one last look, but the figure was gone. I chuckled to myself and fell asleep, dismissing the whole experience as a result of too much fun. The next day, I tried to forget about it and went on with my day. We spent the first part of it fishing at a large pond, and after lunch we went shooting. One guy brought a compound bow. After dinner, we opened more beers and attempted a poker game, but it quickly turned into another night of storytelling around the fire. During one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, a sudden sound of a stick snapping nearby scared me, and I hurried back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made my friends laugh heartily. I tried to explain what I heard, but they reminded me that we weren't the only creatures in those woods. Their reasoning seemed valid, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were gathered, deep in conversation when I turned to talk to the guy next to me. What I saw made me tense up so much I felt like I could snap a steel rod with my fear. Standing just behind my friend was a man I didn't recognize. It was as if he had appeared out of thin air. What was creepier was the way he stared intently at the back of my friend's head, almost as if he was trying to see through it. I remained frozen, and the longer I stared at him, the more I realized he looked just like the figure I had seen outside the light of the fire the night before. He was of average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend kept talking, oblivious to the shadow behind him. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank look and walked away. It was only then that my friend noticed the horrified expression on my face. When he spoke, my fear was released, and I started pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and another friend laughed at me again, refusing to believe I was seeing things. I described the man in detail, and one of them joked that he might be Bigfoot. Despite my protests, no one was convinced, and I eventually gave up trying to explain. However, their teasing only fueled my determination to find out more about the mysterious man. The next couple of days passed quietly, with no sign of him. By the fifth morning, I was starting to doubt my sanity. I had seen this strange man lingering around us twice, and now he had vanished without a trace. I decided to put my investigation on hold until I had new evidence. My friend's dad mentioned that someone who owned a nearby property had spotted a small group of wild hogs running across his land. So we grabbed our rifles and went searching for them. After walking a mile or so down one of the main roads, we found some hog wallows, realizing we were on the right track. We walked on foot for another mile until we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting around, ready to make bacon. 2 of us quietly chambered a round in our rifles and took aim. I was just about to say 3 and pull the trigger when a loud gunshot rang out, followed by a burst of wood and bark right above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to sink in that someone was shooting at us. A few seconds later, another shot rang out, even closer to my friend. We didn't stick around for a third shot. The friend who seemed to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots were fired as we fled, but instead of finding safety at the cabin, the shooting resumed. With no other choice, we jumped into my truck and sped away. This was before everyone had cell phones, so we had to drive 20 miles to town for help. After explaining what happened, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the vehicles parked and waited to see if the shooting would start again. But nothing happened. A quick inspection revealed 3 bullet holes in the cabin and 2 in my buddy's windshield. The worst part was that all our camping gear, including sleeping bags, was scattered all over the ground. Fortunately, we had consumed everything the night before, and nothing was missing except a box of .30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form among the deputies that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping on the land for some reason. They acted like they would let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he pressured them to start a search. Around the same time, I recounted my experience of seeing someone lurking near the cabin. No one was laughing anymore. My story was finally taken seriously. The search was led around the property by my friend's father. By the time it happened, school had already started again, and the search continued for a full week, but they found nothing except a few old camps. It was assumed that he had moved on, knowing the heat would be on him after the shooting. During the investigation, several leads were followed to identify the stranger, including checking for escaped convicts, but he remains unknown to this day. Due to the fear of another attack, our visits to the property ceased the following year. We tried camping elsewhere, but it just wasn't the same, and our outdoor adventures gradually faded away. Within 5 years, my friend's dad suffered a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company renewed its lease, and the land's trees have since been used to produce paper and pulp products. Every time I jot down a note, I'm reminded of our incredible trips, especially the strange and terrifying week that ended them. I still talk to my old college friend on the phone once or twice a year, and as far as he knows, that crazy stranger has never been caught. We sometimes theorize about his origins and where he might have ended up. However, I often take it further. When I'm alone, I can't help but wonder why this so-called stranger seems to focus his anger on my friend and, more troubling, whether he's still out there, waiting for a chance to finish what he started all those years ago. I need convincing every time camping is mentioned with friends or family. I enjoy the outdoors and appreciate nature. I just prefer sleeping in a bed rather than on the ground inside a tent. This particular year, my partner persuaded me to go camping, but thankfully we would be staying in a cabin so I could sleep in a proper bed. I still preferred the beach, but at least I was actually going to sleep in a bed. The trip included my boyfriend, me, and 2 other couples. The 6 of us found a lovely cabin nestled in the woods, mostly isolated and only a short walk of about 100 yards to a beautiful lake where we could swim. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to enjoy the trip quite a bit, especially once we arrived. The first day was fantastic. We spent the entire day exploring trails, swimming in the lake, and in the early evening we decided to grill some steaks. It was a great start to our adventure. That night, we all went inside and went to bed around midnight, if I had to guess. I didn't sleep well. I thought I heard something outside throughout the night, but I just attributed it to my imagination. After all, we were in the woods, so hearing odd noises at night isn't that unusual. The next morning, we were outside preparing for a nice hike when we heard a cheerful voice shout from behind us. "Well, hello there. How's everyone doing today?" My boyfriend, being the outgoing person he is, started chatting with the guy right away. He introduced himself as Wayne and mentioned he was familiar with all the trails around here. The interaction felt a bit odd, but not alarming. He said he lived nearby, was out hiking, and just wanted to check if we were settling in okay. I thought it was nice of him to stop by. He was a large man, probably over 6 feet tall, with a noticeable belly. Dressed in hiking boots and jeans, he looked like your average local hiker. We thanked him, and he laughed in a cheerful way before continuing on his way. As we hiked, we joked about Wayne for a while. In the afternoon, we all headed to the lake to swim for a few hours before returning to the cabin. While sitting on the dock soaking up the sun, we heard Wayne's voice again from beyond the trees. There they are. We all jumped, startled because now Wayne was standing at the edge of the dock again. We asked him what he was doing, and again he claimed he was just wandering by and noticed us. My boyfriend laughed it off and chatted with him for a little while, but my friend Tina's boyfriend and I felt uneasy during their conversation. Wayne kept nodding, laughing, and looking around. After their chat, he mumbled, "Okay," under his breath and walked away. It was strange, but not yet scary. That night, as we sat around the campfire sharing spooky stories, I felt even more uncomfortable. Suddenly, Wayne leaped out of the bushes without warning, shouting in a joking tone, "Here I am!" followed by a loud laugh. We all jumped, even more startled than at the dock. My boyfriend got upset and told Wayne to leave us alone and go home. He explained that scaring us like that was not cool, and Wayne was lucky we hadn't reacted out of instinct. Wayne looked upset, claiming he was just trying to help us have a memorable trip. He wandered off down one of the trails, looking quite visibly downcast. I almost felt bad for him until I realized it was past 11 p.m., and there was no good reason for him to be wandering near our camp. This encounter cast a shadow over the rest of the evening, and we decided to call it a night shortly after. We went inside and tidied up since we were supposed to leave early in the morning. As I lay in bed, I told my boyfriend I was feeling uneasy about the whole Wayne situation. I had a nagging feeling he might come back. I couldn't shake the thought that the strange noise I heard the night before could have been him. That night, I lay awake again. I lost track of time, but at some point, I clearly heard breathing and footsteps outside the window. I woke my boyfriend and urged him to check for me. He was annoyed at first, but then his expression changed completely. I saw him glance outside, and his face turned as pale as a ghost. He whispered to me that he could see someone pacing back and forth outside the cabin, and he thought it was Wayne. I crept to the window, trying not to attract attention. What appeared to be Wayne seemed to be talking to himself, almost incoherently. He tried to open our locked door, and when he couldn't, he began banging his head in frustration. After pacing for a few more minutes, he simply vanished back into the woods. We were terrified and didn't know what to do. My boyfriend called the cabin owner and told him we were also calling the police. A police car arrived a few minutes later, and we recounted the day's events to the officer, including Wayne's odd behavior. The officer didn't seem too concerned and just nodded along, as if he was only half listening and didn't quite grasp how serious the situation was. We packed our belongings, made some coffee, and stayed awake until dawn. When the sun rose, we loaded up the van and headed home. Once we reached the main road, we spotted Wayne walking alone, still mumbling to himself and occasionally hitting his head. We called the dispatcher to report that we had just seen Wayne, the man who tried to break into our cabin earlier. That was the end of our involvement. I'm not sure if the police eventually caught him or if he simply disappeared back into the woods. I wonder if he truly lived nearby or if he was just a strange man wandering around with harmful intentions. I'm grateful nothing happened to us, but from now on, everyone else can go camping without me. It was October in northern Idaho. Fall had settled into the mountains, attracting bow hunters looking for mountain goats. My cousin, let's call him Chad for anonymity, is an enthusiastic hunter. He's explored many parts of North America, hunting various game such as bears in Montana, wild boars in Texas, and bighorn sheep in Colorado. However, his favorite hunting ground was the Lemhi Mountain Range in northern Idaho. Our family has hunted in those mountains for generations. We know every riverbed and mountain peak like others know their own neighborhoods. Mountain goats are intriguing creatures to hunt. They live high above the tree line in rocky terrains and are incredibly sure-footed, able to navigate near vertical slopes. Pursuing these animals requires venturing into dangerous areas, where a single misstep on a rocky path or a loose stone can lead to dire consequences. Chad was an expert mountain hunter, something he seemed destined to do. Chad chose to hunt in the Hayden River area of the Lemhi Mountains, a spot well known to locals, rich with mountain goats. The first mile of his hike was uneventful as he climbed the canyon, the crisp air causing his breath to billow like smoke. The sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains when Chad stumbled upon a small deer trail. Thinking it might be a nice shortcut from his usual path, he decided to take it. A few hundred feet along the trail, he noticed something unusual emerge from behind a tree. It was a man dressed in a light denim jacket and jeans, carrying a small backpack. Chad paused for a moment, trying to figure out where this guy had come from. The man waved to him with both arms, one hand clutching an older-style hunting bow. Chad waved back. Although the man seemed physically all right, it was evident that he was emotionally unsettled. The man shouted something that Chad couldn't quite catch and waved his arm, signaling that Chad should follow him. Chad didn't feel any sense of danger from this man. He could tell he genuinely needed help. He began to follow him up the canyon, but he could never quite catch up. The man always stayed just far enough ahead that conversation was impossible. Periodically, the man would stop, turn to ensure Chad was still following, and every time he looked back, Chad could see the concern etched on his face. Chad tried to remain calm and keep a smile on his face, unsure of what or who he was being led to. It was strange, Chad thought as he hiked, how he hadn't seen any vehicles on his drive to the trailhead. Perhaps the man had come in from another ridge. What could he possibly be leading him to? Chad assumed one of his hunting party members must have been injured and needed assistance, but it would help if the man would stop and talk to him for a moment. Chad lost sight of the man just past a bend in the trail, which opened into a steep, rocky slope. He looked in every direction but couldn't find the man until he heard a whistle. Glancing up, he saw the man about 500 feet up the slope, waving at him. There was no way he could have scaled that rocky incline in the short time Chad had lost him. Still, Chad didn't feel fear or anxiety about the odd situation. The man was now waving more urgently, almost begging Chad to follow him up the slope. With a grunt, Chad began to climb the rocks. Each step sent small rocks tumbling down, causing him to lose his footing repeatedly. Puffing in the cool, thin air, Chad eventually reached a small ledge after nearly 45 minutes of hard climbing. From that vantage point, he saw the man from below, but there was no sign of him now. Exhausted and out of breath, Chad sat down on the rocky ledge and looked around. He still couldn't see the man anywhere. As he scanned the area, something unusual caught his eye. A weathered boot was sticking out from a boulder about 20 feet away. Approaching it, he discovered two boots, and beneath the boulder were bones. Chad glanced around once more for the man but didn't see him again. Instead of feeling spooked or anxious, Chad experienced a wave of relief wash over him. These emotions felt like they came from the world around him. He marked the spot with his GPS and decided to head back down to contact the authorities. The Lemhi County Sheriff's Office responded promptly, and he guided them back up the canyon to the body. It took 4 men to shift the boulder aside, and when they did, they uncovered the skeletal remains of a man. Among the belongings found were hunting gear and personal items. Using a credit card discovered in the wallet, they identified the man as a bow hunter who had been missing for nearly 53 years. Chad didn't want to be publicly recognized or identified by the missing hunter's family. He wasn't looking for any attention for what he considered a strange mountain story. He felt glad that the family could find closure, even if it came decades later. What troubled him was the man who had led him up the canyon and his sudden disappearance. He mentioned the waving man to the sheriff but brushed it off. When news reports emerged announcing the discovery, several photos of the man were published. Chad was stunned to see the man he had followed up the mountain. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The man's anxious demeanor, the constant checking to see if Chad was following, and the relief he felt when the body was found. That man had been desperate to return home, and through Chad, he was finally able to reunite with his family. I'm sharing this for 80% entertainment and 20% feedback. This is completely non-fiction. I'm not a spiritual person. I tend to resist energies and vibes, although I know others are more in tune with their surroundings. I'm skeptical, especially when it comes to paranormal activities. I live in the foothills of western North Carolina, at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I've been in the mountains for a few years and have always disliked it there. I have a strong dislike for the woods. Just my luck. I've moved back in with my parents at their cabin, which is surrounded by trees. Our family owns about 15 acres of woodland, the same woods I grew up in. Despite my usual dislike for nature, I feel a strange sense of safety in these woods. As a child, I climbed trees, splashed in the creek, and fought with stick swords. These woods feel like home, except for the area behind my backyard. Our cabin is at the top of a steep hill that slopes down about half a mile before reaching a creek deep in the woods. Halfway between the house and the creek lies a small patch of trees right behind the fenced-in part of the yard. It's always shaded there, with no thick undergrowth, just trees, Carolina red clay, and piles of leaves. But something feels really off down there, and I can't explain it. I feel unwelcome, and it's not just me. My parents also keep their distance, and even our pets past and present avoid that area. I'll share some experiences to illustrate my point better. When I was around 8 or 9, I decided to camp in the backyard one summer. I set up our family's used tent and filled it with an air mattress, blankets, my favorite stuffed deer named Copper, and some comic books. I wanted to make it exciting, but even before the sun set, while my mom helped me set up, I felt uneasy. The shady path of trees around the backyard was unsettling, but I thought, I'm only 20 feet from the house. I'll be okay. To those reading this, I was not okay. I settled in for the night, feeling like a true outdoorsman as I read comics. It barely got dark when I began hearing loud, rhythmic crunching sounds from the woods behind the backyard, like something large was circling through the underbrush. We don't have bears in this area, and whatever it was, it definitely walked on 2 legs. It never tried to come closer to the backyard, even while I sat there with Copper, just listening. I barely lasted an hour in that tent before bolting inside to my own bed. My mom is an avid gardener, and one day she decided to create several raised garden beds in the backyard for herbs and vegetables. This was when I was about 11, so naturally, I got roped into helping her. We spent the early part of spring building the beds and getting everything planted. I noticed that both of us became quite edgy and irritable while working out there. We've always been best friends, so we rarely argue, but we found ourselves snapping at each other over that stupid garden. I also realized for the first time how eerily quiet the woods behind the house were. Playing music or chatting didn't seem to help. It was that kind of silence that presses down on you, and it's always like that back there. The plants actually thrived for a while, but my mom would always ask me to come with her when she tended to them. I thought it was silly back then. As I got older, she explained that she just couldn't go down there alone. She would wait for me to come home from school before checking on them because she felt too uneasy and unwelcome. Eventually, we gave up on the project. The raised beds are still back there, by the way, rotting away in the underbrush. I haven't checked on them since middle school, and now I'm 23. Lastly, I think the creepiest experience was the time I asked my mom to cut my hair. We didn't have much money back then, so rather than go to a salon, she would give me trims every couple of weeks. It was late spring and warm, so she suggested cutting my hair in the backyard for easier cleanup. I was about 13 or 14 at this time. We went down there, and I brought a stool to sit on while she cut my hair. Just a side note, my mom has always cut my hair and is very skilled at it. She never makes mistakes, and that's important. As she worked and we chatted, I felt that familiar, unsettling feeling. We were definitely unwelcome back there. The trees stood still and shadowy, even though it was a brilliantly sunny day. I remember it feeling cold, very cold. Once she finished my haircut, I shook off the extra hair to let her admire her work. She stepped in front of me, angled my head this way and that, and said it looked good. Then 3 things happened in quick succession. First, I felt an odd pressure on my chest, like I couldn't breathe. It was such a strange sensation that I just froze, and all the uneasiness of the atmosphere closed in on me at once. Second, my mom had a weird, vacant look in her eyes. I remember her smile fading, and her eyes went glassy, as if she were lost in thought. Then she reached out with the scissors, still with that empty expression, and accidentally snipped a deep cut into the skin just above my left eye. I panicked, jumped off the stool, and backed away, and at that moment, she seemed to snap out of it and was almost in tears. She apologized over and over, and we rushed back inside without taking anything with us to treat the cut and stop the bleeding. I still have a small scar there today, and she's never forgiven herself for it. There wasn't even any hair over that eye either. I had a pixie cut at the time. So yeah, those are just a few of the many strange experiences that made me avoid the backyard. I haven't even been back there in 7 or 8 years, but now that I'm living here again, I sometimes glance into the backyard and feel that weird chill of unease. Why don't we feel welcome in a small patch of land we own? Why is it always so dark and silent? I have no clue, but my parents and I just work around it and pretend it isn't there. I went camping with my friends, Nate, Oliver, and Mark, the summer after we finished high school. We had been close friends throughout most of our school years. Our other friend, Josh, couldn't join us because he had started college the previous year and was still away. We had all been camping before, but not in this specific location. We were warned to be cautious of bears, but we weren't too worried since we all knew bear safety well. Nate even brought along his rifle just in case. We had heard from one of our teachers that the campsite we picked was stunning and tranquil, with a beautiful lake and plenty of hiking paths. Excited, we drove to the site and then hiked in for about 3 hours since there was no car access. The hike wasn't tough. You could probably manage it on a four-wheeler if you had good skills. But we didn't have one, so we hiked. We carried our tents, sleeping bags, and supplies on our backs. The trail was picturesque, and we joked and chatted all the way. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were chirping happily. We spotted some bear droppings, but it didn't bother us. In fact, we were eager to see a bear. When we reached our campsite with plenty of daylight left, we were amazed by its beauty. We found a nice spot by the lake and set up our tents among the trees, which provided plenty of shade. The water was crystal clear, and we could see fish occasionally leaping. After gathering some firewood, we built a fire. Feeling adventurous, I decided to explore the area, and Mark joined me. We hiked for a few hours, soaking in the stunning scenery. As we walked, we found more signs of bears, including scratch marks on trees and large piles of droppings. We began to feel a bit uneasy but reassured ourselves that we'd be fine as long as we didn't do anything foolish. Upon returning to our campsite, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. By then, Nate and Oliver had hoisted what remained of our food high in a tree to keep it away from any bears. That's really the minimum you need to do in such situations. We stayed up, lounging around the fire. It was a perfect night so far. We eventually went to bed around 3 a.m. I fell asleep the moment I lay down. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. Confused and disoriented, I sat up in my tent, which was still dim as if the sun was just beginning to rise. Checking my phone, I saw that it was 5:20 a.m. I heard loud growling noises and peeked out of my tent to see a massive bear tearing apart Oliver's tent. Oliver was screaming and trying to escape. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. I got out of my tent and stood there, wanting to help my friend but knowing I couldn't. Then, Nate sprang up, grabbed his rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air, causing the bear to vanish. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and my ears rang. I looked at Nate, who still held his rifle. He looked pale and shaken. In that moment, we realized we needed to leave the campsite immediately. We packed up our gear and hurried down the trail, with Nate clutching the rifle the entire way. We were too frightened to remain in the area, even though we had planned to stay for 3 more nights. We hiked back to our car as quickly as we could, not wanting to look back or think about what could have happened if Nate hadn't scared the bear away. Once we reached our car, we drove to the nearest ranger station and reported the bear encounter. The ranger told us we were fortunate to have escaped and reminded us to always be cautious when camping in bear territory. We drove to a nearby town and found an inexpensive motel for the night. We spent hours discussing the incident and how lucky we were to be alive. Nate emerged looking like a hero, and honestly, he deserved it. I live in Vermont and have spent nearly my whole life here, always feeling at home in the woods. They've always brought me peace, and I've never really feared being in them, especially during the day. Nature in Vermont isn't too scary. I may not be the quietest person, but I'm aware of the noise I make and the sounds around me. I've had moments when the woods fell silent a few times, but if I stand still, the sounds usually return within a minute. Twice, I experienced complete silence in the woods, and it made me uneasy. The first time was when I was hiking with my then-girlfriend on Mount Abe, maybe in 2012. There's a spot on the trail that's unique and beautiful. The trees thin out, and moss covers most of the ground. While we were walking through this area, the woods went quiet, and we both stopped. She asked if I felt it too, and I said something felt off but laughed it off, joking that the silence was due to my heavy breathing. We started moving again with her ahead of me, but the quiet continued. I felt as if someone was watching me from behind. This stretch of the trail isn't very long, maybe half an hour, but time felt like it was standing still. Finally, we reached the intersection with another trail and stopped again. Just up the path, less than 30 feet away, we both saw someone dart across the trail and hide behind a small dead tree. They peeked out but quickly disappeared behind the trunk. This tree would have been hard to hide behind for anyone but a small child. Without thinking, I walked past her and headed over to the tree to look around. There was nothing there. Suddenly, the woods seemed to come back to life. I returned to her and we talked about what had just happened. We both agreed that this part of the trail felt like it took much longer than it should have, and we noticed how uneasy the silence was, almost like we weren't alone. We both saw someone run behind that tree and peek out, but we didn't know what to make of it, so we laughed it off. I continued to the peak, and we had a meal before relaxing there for a bit, then headed back down the way we came, nothing else occurring. I've hiked that trail before and never had anything like that happen again. The second time I felt that eerie silence was in the fall of 2016. I was out behind my apartment, which had a large area of woods. The nearest road was about 3 miles east, and the roads to the north and south were maybe 10 miles away, with woods separating them. One day, I was about a mile deep into the woods, and everything was alive with birds, squirrels, and chipmunks preparing for winter. Suddenly, the woods fell silent. I paused, expecting it to wake back up, thinking it was just me rustling the leaves and stepping on twigs. Then I heard something moving slowly behind me in the near distance. I looked around, but there was nothing. The woods remained quiet. I walked a bit further and stopped again, hearing the sound of something moving in the distance but not seeing it. I repeated this a few more times with the same result. I started to feel uneasy, so I cut north, aiming to go down a ravine and head west. After getting out of the ravine, I paused once more, the woods still quiet, when I heard heavy footsteps landing on the leaves coming closer. I quickly zigzagged all the way back to my apartment. Since then, I've gone out again, but I've never had another experience like that. They say we don't have cougars or mountain lions here, and I think I would have recognized a bear or coyote early on. What do you all think? Have you ever experienced the woods going quiet yourself? Thank you. I decided to spend the weekend in an isolated cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a break from my hectic life. The cabin was a simple, wooden structure surrounded by towering trees. I arrived just before sunset, and after unpacking, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I made a small fire outside and enjoyed the fresh air and the sounds of nature. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The cheerful chirping of birds faded, replaced by eerie silence. I felt the cool breeze on my skin, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the fire. After a while, I decided to head inside. I locked the door and settled onto the couch with a book. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and I lost myself in the story. but the quiet soon became unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise made me jump. I told myself it was just my imagination. As I read, I suddenly heard a loud crack from outside. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. I put my book down and listened intently. There was nothing but silence again, but the tension in the air was thick. I convinced myself it was probably just a branch falling. I tried to return to my book, but my mind kept wandering back to the sound. I set the book aside and grabbed a flashlight. I needed to check outside to reassure myself that everything was fine. I opened the door carefully, shining the light into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air against my face. The forest was still, but I sensed something was off. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the trees. I squinted, trying to see better. There it was again, a dark shape shifting among the branches. My instincts told me to retreat, but I felt compelled to investigate. I slowly walked toward the trees, my flashlight beam flickering across the ground. The darkness felt alive, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I stumbled over a root and fell to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and went out. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to get up, my breath coming in quick gasps. I fumbled for the flashlight, and when I found it, I switched it back on. The light flickered for a moment before shining brightly again. But when I looked up, the dark shape was gone. I stood there, trying to calm myself, but every rustle of leaves made me jump. I knew I needed to get back inside. I hurried toward the cabin, the feeling of being watched creeping back over me. Once inside, I locked the door again and sat on the couch, heart racing. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. I decided to stay awake, listening for any more sounds. Hours passed, and I finally began to relax. Just as I thought I could drift off to sleep, I heard a noise, louder this time, like something heavy was moving around outside. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. My thoughts raced as I tried to decide what to do. Should I call for help? Would anyone even hear me? I felt trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window. I slowly pulled the curtain aside and peeked out. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the dim light, I saw a large figure moving close to the cabin. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was big. Much bigger than a deer or any animal I knew. I stepped back from the window, panic surging again. I needed to defend myself. I searched the cabin and found a heavy wooden chair. I placed it against the door, feeling more secure with something blocking my way. I returned to the window, peeking out again. The figure was still there, lurking just outside. Then it moved closer, and I could finally see what it was. A huge, shaggy dog, clearly lost and frightened. Relief flooded over me. It seemed to sense my presence and stopped, staring back at me with sad eyes. I felt a wave of guilt wash over my fear. The dog must have been abandoned or separated from its owner. I opened the door slowly, the chair still blocking it but leaving enough space for the dog to enter. It hesitated at first, sniffing the air, then cautiously stepped inside. I knelt down, my fear fading as the dog approached me. I found a blanket and some leftover food in the cabin and offered it to the dog. It ate hungrily, tail wagging slightly. I realized I had found a companion in my moment of fear, a friend in the quiet wilderness. That night, I felt safe with the dog by my side. Together, we shared the cabin, and the forest no longer felt so lonely. When morning came, I had a new sense of purpose. I decided to search for the dog's owner when I returned to the city. It was a scary night, but it ended with a new friendship and a feeling of hope. I was excited about my weekend trip to the cabin. It was a small place my family used to visit when I was a kid. Now, as an adult, I needed a break from my busy life. I packed my bags and set off, eager for some peace in the woods. The cabin was just as I remembered, rustic and a bit worn down, surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful lake. I unloaded my car and settled in, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling sound comforting against the backdrop of the quiet woods. As night fell, I sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the stars appear in the sky. Everything felt perfect. But as I turned in for the night, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The darkness outside felt thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with thoughts of the past. I remembered camping trips as a child and the stories my parents told about the woods. I told myself those stories were just that, stories, but a small part of me felt anxious, as if something was out there. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint, like something scratching against the side of the cabin. My heart raced. I strained to listen, but the noise stopped. I waited, trying to calm myself, but my imagination started to run wild. What if it was a bear? Or maybe someone trying to get in? I decided I needed to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual, just trees and shadows swaying in the wind. I felt a bit foolish, but the unease remained. After a few moments, I turned away from the window, but then I heard it again, this time louder and closer. It sounded like it was right outside the door. I froze, clutching the flashlight tightly. The scratching turned into a soft thud, and my pulse quickened. I knew I had to do something. I moved slowly to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, trying to listen. The thuds continued, but there was a strange rhythm to them. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. With trembling hands, I opened the door a crack and shined my flashlight outside. I gasped when I saw what was making the noise. A large animal was at the bottom of the steps, pawing at the ground. It looked like a bear, but something felt off. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it seemed to be struggling. Without thinking, I stepped outside, the light guiding my way. The bear looked up at me, and I felt a mix of fear and sympathy. It was clear it wasn't here to attack. Instead, it seemed lost and scared, like it needed help. I backed away slowly, not wanting to provoke it. I remembered my food supplies inside. I thought if I could offer it something to eat, maybe it would go away peacefully. I rushed back into the cabin and grabbed some leftover food I had. I carefully placed it on the porch, then retreated inside. Peeking through the window, I watched as the bear cautiously approached the food, sniffed around, then began to eat. I felt relieved. It was just hungry, not a threat. I continued to watch, feeling a strange connection to this creature. It was just trying to survive, just like I was. After a few moments, the bear finished eating and turned away from the cabin, disappearing back into the woods. I stood there, feeling the adrenaline fade away. I was amazed that I had faced my fear and that the encounter had ended without violence. As dawn broke, the sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow around the cabin. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The night had been terrifying, but it had also reminded me of the beauty and unpredictability of nature. I smiled, knowing I had survived the night and learned something valuable. With a new appreciation for the woods, I took a deep breath, ready to enjoy the rest of my weekend. I stepped outside to greet the morning, feeling grateful for the experience and the quiet peace that now surrounded me. The cabin was a safe haven once again, and I knew I would carry this memory with me for a long time. had been looking forward to my weekend getaway for weeks. After a hectic few months at work, I needed some peace and quiet. I found a cozy cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city. It was the perfect spot to relax, or so I thought. When I arrived, the cabin was just as I imagined. Rustic and charming, with wooden beams and a small porch that overlooked a lake. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine trees. I unpacked my bags and settled in, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and made a simple dinner. After eating, I curled up on the couch with a book, the warm glow of the fire making the cabin feel inviting. But as darkness enveloped the woods outside, a strange feeling crept in. The forest seemed to come alive with sounds, the wind rustling the leaves, branches creaking, and the distant hooting of an owl. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind kept wandering. Then I heard a noise outside. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, but it sounded too close. It was a series of soft thuds, like something or someone was moving near the cabin. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing. I was alone in the woods. It was just my imagination running wild. I forced myself to ignore it and return to my book, but the noise continued. It grew louder, more persistent. I decided to check the windows, shining my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees swaying gently in the wind. I felt foolish for worrying about nothing. A few hours passed and I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound pulled me back to wakefulness. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang against the cabin wall. I jolted upright, my heart racing. The sound echoed in my ears. I lay there, frozen, listening intently. I picked up my phone to check the time, almost midnight. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of bed, clutching it tightly in one hand. I didn't want to believe it, but fear gripped me as I walked toward the front door. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The cool night air hit my face. I scanned the area with my flashlight, shining it toward the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something glimmering in the light, just beyond the reach of the beam. My heart dropped as I realized it was a pair of eyes staring back at me. I quickly turned the flashlight toward the eyes, and they vanished into the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed up, heart pounding, and rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I had to calm down. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon. But then the banging resumed, louder this time. I felt trapped, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I grabbed the frying pan from the kitchen, feeling ridiculous, but I needed something for protection. I returned to the living room, keeping my eyes on the door. The noise continued, and I could feel my heart racing. Then, everything went silent. I stood there, gripping the pan tightly, waiting for the next sound. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, there was a soft whimper outside. Couldn't believe my ears. Curiosity got the better of me. I slowly opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. The whimpering grew louder, and I realized it was coming from just outside the porch. I shone the flashlight and gasped. A small dog, muddy and shivering, was sitting at the foot of the steps, looking up at me with pleading eyes. Relief washed over me. I quickly stepped outside and knelt down, extending my hand. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing my fingers. I felt an overwhelming wave of compassion. It must have been lost, wandering through the woods all alone. I had been so terrified moments ago, but now I felt a sense of purpose. I brought the dog inside, offering it some water and a bit of food I had. It lapped up the water eagerly and devoured the food. As it settled next to me, I felt warmth spreading in my chest. The fear from before faded away. As dawn broke, The first rays of light filled the cabin, and I smiled at my new friend curled up beside me. I realized I had not only found a companion, but also a sense of safety in the fear I had felt. The weekend that had started with dread now felt full of hope. I was no longer alone in the woods. Together, we would face whatever came our way. I had been looking forward to a weekend getaway for months. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a break from the chaos of everyday life. The drive was beautiful, with tall trees lining the winding road and sunlight filtering through the leaves. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as it had in the pictures. Cozy and inviting, with a wooden porch and a small fire pit out back. After unpacking, I stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into a comfy chair with a book. As night fell, the flickering flames cast long shadows across the room. I felt relaxed, almost sleepy, as the crackling fire lulled me into a sense of security. But as I read, I began to hear noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I heard something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably just a deer or another animal, but the sound kept coming, growing closer and louder. I tried to ignore it and focused on my book, but my nerves were on edge. Every time the wind blew, I jumped. Finally, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the dark. The night was still and quiet, but my heart raced. I felt exposed, standing there alone in the cold. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of movement. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. I felt a little foolish. Maybe it really was just an animal. I turned to go back inside, but then I heard it again, a loud snap, like a twig breaking. It was behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I was about to head back when I saw something moving near the edge of the trees. It was quick, disappearing before I could get a good look. Panic surged through me. I backed away toward the cabin, my instincts screaming to go inside. I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, feeling the heat of the fire on my face. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. The sounds outside returned, rustling, snapping, and a low growl that sent chills down my spine. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. I considered calling someone for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. The growling continued, sometimes getting closer, and then fading away. I felt trapped, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay cooped up any longer. I needed to find out what was out there, even if it scared me. I grabbed my flashlight and the heavy fire poker, feeling slightly more secure. I opened the door and stepped outside again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I moved carefully toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the trees. I could see shadows dancing in the beam of light, but nothing moved. I felt a mixture of fear and determination. I wouldn't let whatever was out there control my night. Then, I saw it again, a flash of movement. I directed my light to where it had been and found myself staring at a large animal. It wasn't a bear or anything dangerous. It was a wolf, lean and hungry, watching me from a distance. I froze, holding my breath. It was just as scared of me as I was of it. I realized that the wolf was likely hungry and lost, just like I felt. In that moment, I didn't see a threat. I saw a creature struggling to survive. I took a step back, slowly, and the wolf remained still, observing me. I knew I had to get back inside, but I felt a strange sense of connection with this wild animal. I retreated to the cabin, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat by the fire again, my heart still racing, but now I felt a strange calm wash over me. I knew the wolf was out there, but I also knew it meant me no harm. I realized I wasn't truly alone in the woods. There were living beings all around me, sharing this space. The rest of the night passed without incident. I heard the wolf moving around outside for a while, but eventually, it grew quiet. When morning came, I opened the door to find the world bathed in soft light. The forest looked different, more alive, and less threatening. I decided to leave the cabin, not out of fear, but with a sense of gratitude for the experience. I packed my things, ready to return to my normal life, but I felt changed. I had faced my fears and learned that sometimes, the things that scare us can also bring us unexpected understanding and connection. I needed a break from everything, so I rented a small cabin in the woods for the weekend. It was isolated, surrounded by tall trees, and that's exactly what I wanted. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind, feeling more relaxed with each mile. When I finally arrived, I was pleased to see that the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was charming, with wooden walls and a little porch. Once inside, I unpacked my things and settled in. The sun was shining, and I felt happy as I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch to enjoy the view. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. It was peaceful, but as the sun began to set, I felt a slight chill in the air. I decided to go for a short walk to explore the area. I wandered through the woods, admiring the trees and the soft ground beneath my feet. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating beautiful patterns on the ground. After a while, I turned back, feeling content. That evening, I lit a fire in the cabin's fireplace, its warmth making the place feel cozy. I made dinner and settled down with a book. But as darkness enveloped the cabin, I began to feel uneasy. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but outside, the forest felt alive with sounds I couldn't identify. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just animals moving around. As I read, I heard a loud thump against the cabin wall. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like something heavy had hit the outside of the cabin. I set the book down and listened intently. The sounds of the forest faded, leaving only my pounding heart. I got up and moved to the window, shining my flashlight outside, but there was nothing to see. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on my book, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The thumping came again, this time followed by a soft scraping sound. It felt like something was moving around the cabin. I stood up, clutching the flashlight, my mind racing with possibilities. I decided to check the door and make sure it was locked. I walked to the front door and pulled on the handle. It was secure. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I returned to the couch and turned off the lights, relying on the fire's glow. But then I heard it again. This time it was a series of knocks, rhythmic and steady. I grabbed the frying pan from the kitchen, holding it tightly as I crept toward the door. The sounds continued, and I felt a rush of fear. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. With shaking hands, I opened the door a crack. The night air was cold, and I scanned the porch with my flashlight. Still nothing. I stepped outside, my heart racing. I took a few cautious steps, shining the light around, but the forest was still. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned quickly, shining the light towards the sound. There, emerging from the shadows, was a large animal. My heart dropped as I realized it was a deer, caught in the moonlight. Stood still, looking at me with big eyes. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. As the deer moved away, I returned to the cabin, closing the door behind me. I sat back down, feeling foolish for being so scared. I tried to shake it off, but as I prepared for bed, I heard a noise again. This time, it sounded like something heavy dragging across the ground outside. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I looked around for anything else I could use. I felt trapped and anxious. I went to the window again, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was out there. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I saw movement again. My breath caught in my throat. It was the deer again, but it wasn't alone. There were several of them, gathered close to the cabin, their eyes reflecting the light like tiny mirrors. I watched in awe as they milled around, snorting softly and occasionally bumping against the walls. They were harmless, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. After a while, they wandered off into the trees, leaving me alone again. I finally relaxed, realizing that the only danger was my own fear. I crawled into bed, feeling grateful for the unexpected visitors. I had let my imagination run wild, thinking of worst-case scenarios when all I needed to do was appreciate the moment. As the night passed, I slept soundly, knowing that sometimes what we fear isn't as scary as it seems. When morning came, the sun lit up the cabin, and I smiled, feeling refreshed. I had faced my fear and found a sense of calm in the quiet of the woods. It wasn't just a weekend away. It was a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. I needed a break from my hectic life, so I decided to spend the weekend at a cabin deep in the woods. I rented a small place that looked cozy in the photos. The moment I arrived, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with a hint of nervousness. It was just me, nature, and the peaceful silence of the forest. The cabin was simple but charming, with a wooden porch and a fireplace. After unpacking, I explored the area. The tall trees surrounded me like silent guardians, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. I felt free and at ease as I walked along the dirt path, breathing in the fresh air. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled onto the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and I began to forget about the busy world I had left behind. But soon the serenity shifted. I started hearing noises outside, the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. It made my heart race. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was probably just an animal. After all, I was in the woods. I continued reading, but my mind wandered. The noises became more distinct. I couldn't focus. I stood up and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the thick blackness outside. I saw nothing. As I returned to the couch, the sounds outside grew louder. It sounded like footsteps. I felt a chill run down my spine. I reminded myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't help much. The cabin felt smaller and more isolated. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to come barging in. I decided to distract myself with a snack, hoping the noises would fade away. I rummaged through my bag, but the rustling outside grew closer, and my stomach twisted with anxiety. I grabbed my phone to check for a signal, but it showed nothing. I felt trapped, alone, and a little foolish for coming here by myself. I took a deep breath and forced myself to be calm. I reminded myself that I was safe inside the cabin. But then, a loud bang echoed against the cabin wall. I jumped, my heart racing. I quickly grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and held it tightly. I moved toward the front door, every sound amplified in my ears. I opened the door slightly, shining the light outside. The beam illuminated the porch but revealed nothing unusual. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The sounds had stopped. I felt ridiculous for being scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The The darkness felt heavy around me, and the trees loomed like shadows. I shone the flashlight around the area, revealing nothing but the quiet woods. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something moving in the bushes. I held my breath, pointing the flashlight in that direction. My heart raced as I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. I felt a surge of fear but kept my light steady. Slowly, a small deer stepped out from the underbrush, its ears twitching as it sensed my presence. It seemed just as startled as I was. Couldn't help but feel relieved. I had been so afraid, imagining all sorts of terrible things. But here was just a deer, a reminder of the beauty of the forest. I smiled, realizing how quickly I had let my imagination take over. The deer took a cautious step back into the bushes, and I stood still, watching it disappear into the night. As I went back inside, I felt lighter. I locked the door and took a moment to breathe. I decided to turn on some music to break the silence. As the familiar tunes filled the cabin, I sank into the couch, feeling safe once again. The fear I had felt earlier was replaced with a sense of calm. That night, I slept soundly, listening to the gentle sounds of the forest around me. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows. The world outside looked different, filled with life and beauty. I felt grateful for the experience, realizing that sometimes fear is just a part of being in a new place. I packed my things and prepared to leave, looking forward to sharing my adventure with friends. The cabin had taught me something important about facing my fears. It was just me and nature, and in the end, it turned out to be a weekend I would always remember. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend alone in a remote cabin seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle of everyday life. I drove for hours, the roads getting narrower and the trees growing denser as I approached the cabin. When I finally arrived, it was just as beautiful as the pictures. A small, wooden structure surrounded by tall pines. After unpacking, I set about exploring the area. The woods were quiet except for the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I wandered around, taking in the beauty of nature. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. Everything felt perfect. As evening fell, I built a fire in the fireplace and cooked a simple meal. The flickering light of the flames cast shadows on the walls, creating a cozy atmosphere. After dinner, I sat on the porch, sipping a cup of tea while watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned dark quickly, and I felt a chill in the air. With darkness came silence. The usual sounds of the forest faded, leaving an unsettling quiet. I returned inside and locked the door, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping in. I curled up on the couch with a book, hoping to distract myself. But my eyes kept drifting to the window. As the night deepened, I heard a strange noise outside, a soft rustling, followed by a low growl. I froze, my heart racing. Was it just an animal? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the noise continued, growing louder and closer. I set the book aside and crept to the window, shining my flashlight outside. The beam of light swept across the porch and into the woods, but I saw nothing. I felt foolish for being scared, so I went back to the couch, but the noises only got worse. I could hear branches snapping and something moving just out of sight. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Then, suddenly, there was a loud thud against the cabin wall. I jumped, adrenaline coursing through my veins. It was too loud to ignore. My instincts screamed at me to grab something for protection. I rushed to the kitchen and found a heavy knife. Holding it tightly, I returned to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The thudding continued, and I felt trapped. I couldn't ignore the noise anymore. I made my way to the door, my hands shaking. I took a deep breath and opened it slightly, peering into the darkness. Nothing, just the empty porch and the forest beyond. I felt silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stepped outside, gripping the knife tightly. The air was cold, and the darkness felt alive, pressing in on me. I listened carefully, and after a moment, I heard the sound again, this time closer. It was a low, menacing growl that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back inside, but something darted past me in the shadows. I stumbled back, heart racing. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating trees and the porch but revealing nothing. I stood frozen, listening as the growl came again, closer this time. My mind raced, and I realized I needed to get inside. I rushed for the door, adrenaline pushing me forward. Just as I reached it, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down to see a large dog, dirty and thin, looking up at me with fearful eyes. Relief flooded over me. I had been terrified of a wild animal, but here was this poor creature, likely lost and hungry. I knelt down, the knife forgotten in my hand. The dog backed away slightly, but I slowly extended my hand, hoping it would trust me. It sniffed my fingers, then stepped closer. I quickly grabbed some food I had in my bag and offered it to the dog. It ate hungrily, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. What I thought was danger had turned out to be a companion in need. I led the dog inside, and it curled up beside the fire, finally at ease. As I sat down, I realized how quickly fear can turn into relief. The night had been frightening, but now I had someone to share the cabin with. With the dog by my side, I felt safe again. I settled in for the night, the shadows no longer threatening but comforting. I had come to the cabin seeking solitude, but I found a new friend instead. Together, we would face whatever the woods had to offer. I had always dreamed of spending a weekend in a cabin deep in the woods. When I finally found a small, rustic place for rent, I couldn't resist. It was surrounded by tall trees and had a clear lake nearby, perfect for a little escape from everyday life. I packed my bags, excited for the adventure. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was cozy with wooden walls and a big porch. I unloaded my things and settled in. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I felt at peace. After exploring the area around the cabin, I decided to go for a hike. I marked the time on my watch and grabbed some water, eager to see what lay beyond the trees. The trail was well-worn and easy to follow. I walked for a while, enjoying the sounds of nature. The birds chirped, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. But after an hour, the path began to narrow, and the trees closed in around me. I realized I had wandered off the main trail, but it felt fine. I was confident I could find my way back. As I continued deeper into the woods, I noticed that the sounds changed. The cheerful birdsong faded, and an eerie silence settled around me. I shivered slightly, dismissing it as a chill in the air. I turned back to retrace my steps, but everything looked different. The trees seemed taller, and the path I had taken was no longer visible. I started to walk faster, my heart racing. I called out to myself to stay calm, but the unease grew. I checked my watch, realizing I had been gone longer than I thought. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I knew I had to get back to the cabin before it got too dark. Panic set in as I wandered through the underbrush. I tried to remember the way I came, but every direction looked the same. The shadows began to stretch, creating dark shapes that played tricks on my eyes. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath quickening with every step. The feeling of being watched crept in, but I pushed it aside. After what felt like hours, I finally found a clearing. I took a deep breath, hoping to see the cabin or at least a familiar landmark. Instead, I noticed something strange. A small, abandoned campsite lay ahead. It was overgrown with weeds, and the fire pit was cold and empty. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming that I should turn back. As I inspected the campsite, I found old camping gear scattered around. Broken chairs, a rusted pot, and a weathered backpack. I opened the backpack, hoping to find something useful, but it was empty except for a crumpled map. It looked ancient and torn, but I could make out some of the trails. One of them seemed to lead back toward the cabin, so I decided to follow it. I clutched the map tightly as I made my way through the trees. The sun was almost down now, and I could barely see. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I quickened my pace, but the shadows seemed to twist and shift as I moved. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, rustling leaves and snapping twigs. My heart dropped, and I turned around, shining my flashlight in that direction. The beam revealed nothing but trees and darkness. I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was just an animal. But the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I pushed forward, the map clutched in my hands. Just as I began to lose hope, I saw a faint light through the trees. My heart raced with relief, and I hurried toward it. I stumbled out of the woods and found myself at the edge of the lake, the cabin just a short distance away. The porch light was on, a beacon guiding me home. I sprinted toward the cabin, tears of relief filling my eyes. Once inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The comfort of the walls wrapped around me, and I finally felt safe. I realized that my adventure could have ended badly, but I had found my way back just in time. As I sat on the couch, looking out at the calm lake, I felt grateful. The experience taught me the importance of staying aware of my surroundings. I made a promise to myself to be more careful in the future. With the cabin lights illuminating the darkness outside, I finally relaxed, knowing that the woods had lost their hold on me. I would cherish this moment, and I would never forget the lessons learned in those shadowy trees. I decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. It was a little getaway I had planned for months. I wanted to escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. The cabin was small, surrounded by tall trees, and it felt like the perfect place to relax. When I arrived, the sun was shining, and everything seemed calm. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the fireplace, and settled into the cozy living room. The wooden walls and the smell of pine made the cabin feel warm and inviting. After making some lunch, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was beautiful. The trees were tall, and the sunlight peeked through the leaves. I walked for a while, enjoying the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling tired but happy. I lit the fireplace again and sat down with a book. As evening fell, the forest outside grew darker. I noticed how quiet it became, with only the crackling of the fire breaking the silence. I felt a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I was alone in the woods after all. I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, wanting to keep the darkness outside. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like something moving through the brush. I paused, listening carefully. The sound stopped, and I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I climbed into bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I lay there, the noise returned, louder this time. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the leaves. My heart raced. I had no signal on my phone, and the cabin felt isolated. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got out of bed. I felt foolish but also scared. I wanted to know what was out there. I I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the area around the cabin. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, I spotted something moving near the edge of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. It was hard to see, but it looked like a large figure. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it was someone lost? Or worse, what if it was someone dangerous? I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure seemed to hesitate, then moved closer to the cabin. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I quickly turned off the flashlight, feeling the panic rise. I stepped back from the window, thinking about what to do. I considered grabbing my car keys and leaving, but I didn't want to risk being outside alone in the dark. I waited, listening. The sound of footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to look again. I pulled the curtain back slowly, shining the flashlight outside once more. This time, the figure was gone. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Where had it gone? I didn't want to linger too long by the window, so I backed away and locked the door, securing it as best I could. I lay back in bed, trying to convince myself I was safe. I focused on the sound of the wind outside, which had picked up, rustling the leaves. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke early the next morning, sunlight spilling into the cabin. I felt much better, but the events of the night still lingered in my mind. I decided to check outside. Maybe it was all just my imagination. Stepping outside, the fresh air hit me, and I took a deep breath. The world looked different in the daylight. I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of anything unusual. As I walked toward the edge of the woods, I noticed something on the ground. It was a backpack, worn and old, partially hidden by leaves. I picked it up, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear. It was clear that someone had been here recently. I unzipped it and found clothes, some empty food wrappers, and a small flashlight. There were no signs of anyone around now, but I felt uneasy, knowing someone had been so close to my cabin. Realizing I wasn't alone in these woods made my heart race again. I took the backpack and walked back to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, adrenaline fueling my actions. The peaceful weekend I had planned was over. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road behind was empty, just trees and the distant sounds of the forest. I felt relieved to be leaving, but shaken by the realization of what could have happened. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets, and I knew I didn't want to uncover any more of them. I decided that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and sometimes the safety of home is the best kind of adventure. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for weeks. A friend canceled last minute, but I decided to go to the cabin alone anyway. It was a small, rustic place in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I thought some time alone in nature would be relaxing. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered from the photos. The wood was worn, but it had character. I unpacked my things and settled in, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. The air was crisp and fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. That first evening, I lit a fire and sat outside on the porch. The sun set slowly, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. I felt peaceful, but as night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of nature grew louder, and the darkness felt thicker. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping in. After a while, I went inside and closed the door. I turned on a few lights, and the cabin felt warm and cozy again. I made some dinner and settled down on the couch, flipping through a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The shadows outside danced in the flickering light, and I felt like something was watching me. As I read, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like something rustling in the bushes. I paused, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a deep silence. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but unease settled in my stomach. I brushed it off and returned to my book. A few hours later, I decided to go to bed. As I lay there, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, a series of sharp snaps, like branches breaking. My heart raced. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I got out of bed and walked to the window, shining my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I felt silly for being scared, but a part of me remained on edge. I locked the door and climbed back into bed, trying to dismiss the fear. But then I heard it again. This time it sounded closer, almost right outside the cabin. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The snapping continued, accompanied by a low, rustling sound. It was too loud to ignore now, and my pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I felt trapped, unsure of what to do. I decided to grab a flashlight and something to protect myself, just in case. I quietly opened the bedroom door and made my way to the kitchen. I found a heavy frying pan and held it tight in one hand, the flashlight in the other. I stepped carefully to the front door, my breath coming in quick bursts. As I approached, I heard a thud against the wall. I jumped back, my heart racing. It was definitely something out there. I shined the flashlight towards the door, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the noise stopped. I waited, listening hard, but the silence was deafening. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage. I turned the doorknob slowly and opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight outside. Nothing, just the porch, empty and quiet. I stepped outside cautiously, the cool air biting at my skin. I scanned the area, the beam of light revealing nothing unusual. I felt foolish for being scared, thinking maybe it was just a raccoon or something similar. But then, I heard a soft whimper, like a dog crying. My heart sank. I followed the sound to the edge of the woods. As I moved closer, I spotted a small dog, muddy and trembling. It looked lost and scared. I knelt down, feeling relieved to see it was just an animal. I approached slowly, holding out my hand. The dog looked up at me with big, fearful eyes. I coaxed it over, and after a moment, it came to me, wagging its tail hesitantly. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had been so scared, but here was this little creature, just needing help. I took the dog back inside, giving it some water and food I had brought along. I felt a sense of calm return. As I sat on the couch with the dog curled up beside me, I realized that sometimes what we fear most turns out to be something simple, something that needed kindness. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin. I watched the little dog sleep peacefully. I knew I wouldn't be alone anymore, and that made me smile. It was a scary night, but it ended with something good, a new friend to share my adventure with.